He recognized her the moment she looked up from the menu. 20 years, 2 decades of silence, of unanswered questions, of a grief he had eventually stopped calling grief and started calling just Tuesday. And now she was sitting across a white-clothed table in a downtown Seattle restaurant, older, polished, carrying herself like someone who had learned that the world responds differently when you have money, but with the same slight tilt of her head when she was thinking. The same way she used to look at the coffee menu in that tiny place on Boylston Street. Landon Hayes gripped the edge of his chair and made a decision in about 4 seconds flat. He was not going to say her name. Before we go any further, if stories about second chances, buried secrets, and the kind of love that refuses to stay buried speak to you, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. We post new stories every week, and some of them will genuinely stop you in your tracks. Like this video if you believe in second chances. And drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The reservation had been made under a name Landon didn't recognize. Greystone Table, 7:00 p.m. Party of 2. Ask for Marcus. Which told him exactly how much thought his friend Joel had put into this. Joel Mercer had been trying to set Landon up with someone for the better part of 3 years. He had the persistence of a man who had found happiness in his own marriage and could not understand why anyone would voluntarily live without it. "But you're 32, Joel had said, leaning against the doorframe of Landon's kitchen, about a week earlier, watching him pack a lunchbox with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it alone for a very long time. You work, you come home, you make dinner, you help with homework, you go to bed. You've been doing that since Marcus was 4 years old." "Marcus is a good kid," Landon said without looking up. "That's not the point." "I know what the point is, Joel. She's someone I met through a client. She's normal. She doesn't know anything about you except that you're a structural engineer who apparently makes very good coffee." Joel paused. "I may have sold you a little on the coffee." Landon looked at him then. "You told a stranger I make good coffee." "I told her you were interesting and had your life together. The coffee thing just came up." Joel folded his arms. "One dinner, that's all I'm asking. If it's terrible, I owe you a 6-pack and we never speak of it again." Landon had said no 3 times before saying yes once, which was apparently enough. He told Marcus that evening at the dinner table, half hoping his 15-year-old son would object and give him a reasonable excuse to cancel. Marcus had instead looked up from his bowl of pasta with an expression that was far too knowing for a teenager. "Finally," Marcus said. "Don't make it weird." "I'm just saying, it's about time." Marcus twirled his fork. "Who is she?" "I don't know, that's the point. It's a blind date." Marcus considered this for a moment. "Cool. Blind dates are statistically more likely to lead to genuine connection because there's no social media preconception to dismantle." Landon stared at him. "Where did you read that?" "I didn't read it anywhere, I made it up. But it sounds true, right?" Landon had gone to bed that night telling himself the whole thing was a one-time exception, a gesture toward Joel's concern, something to be endured politely and then filed away. He picked out a shirt that was neither too casual nor too deliberate. He drove to the restaurant in his 7-year-old Subaru, parallel parked on the second try, and walked in 5 minutes early because he was constitutionally incapable of being late to anything. The hostess smiled and said his guest had already arrived. He followed her through the low-lit dining room, past tables of couples leaning toward each other in the particular way that people do when they want to be heard without being overheard, and then he saw her. She was looking down at the menu. Dark hair, cut shorter than he remembered, swept back from her face. A charcoal blazer over a silk blouse the color of deep water. The kind of woman who had learned how to sit in a room without apologizing for taking up space. She looked up when she heard him approach, and the faintest smile crossed her face. Polite, measured, the smile of someone who was also just doing a favor for someone else. And then the smile stayed in place, but something shifted behind her eyes, something that vanished too quickly for him to read. "You must be Landon," she said. Her voice was the same, slightly lower than you expected, unhurried. "Yeah," he said, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down in a movement that he hoped looked more natural than it felt. "And you're Victoria," she said. "Victoria Sinclair." He'd already known. He'd known since the hostess said your guest has already arrived, and he'd caught the first glimpse of dark hair from 20 feet away. But hearing her say her own name in her own voice, in a restaurant in Seattle, in the year he was 32 years old and the father of a 15-year-old who thought blind dates built genuine connection, it was a different thing entirely. He looked at the menu. He did not know what was on it. "Have you been here before?" he asked. "No, you?" "Once. Business dinner about 2 years ago. The salmon was good." "I'll probably get the salmon then," she said, and set the menu down, and looked at him with those dark, composed eyes that gave very little away, and he thought, she doesn't know. And then, almost immediately, or she does, and she's better at this than I am. The waiter came. They ordered water, then wine, a Pinot Noir she chose without hesitation, which he noted. And then they were alone again with the ambient sound of other people's conversations filling the space around them. "So," Victoria said, "Joel tells me you're a structural engineer." "He tells me nothing about you," Landon said, "which is an interesting imbalance." She almost smiled. "He told me you'd say something like that." "Did he?" "He said you were straightforward. I appreciated the warning." She tilted her head. That same slight tilt, the thinking gesture, the one he had filed away somewhere he hadn't opened in years. "What kind of structures?" "Bridges mostly, some commercial. I'm currently on a pedestrian bridge project over the ship canal. It's been in planning for about 3 years, which is either a sign of thoroughness or bureaucratic paralysis, depending on who you ask." "Which do you think it is?" "Combination. About 60% bureaucracy." She nodded slowly, like she was actually filing that away. "I respect honesty about inefficiency. I deal with a lot of people who pretend everything is running smoothly." "What do you do?" A brief pause. Not evasive, exactly. More like she was deciding how much of the answer to give. "Technology. Software infrastructure, mostly. My company builds systems for large-scale data management." She said it the way some people describe what they do when they don't want the conversation to become about what they do. He would learn later, much later, from a Google search he was slightly ashamed of, that Victoria Sinclair's company was currently valued somewhere north of $4 billion, that she had been on the cover of Forbes twice in the past 5 years, and that her platform managed data pipelines for 3 of the country's largest hospital networks. She had said software infrastructure the way a person says I work in finance when they mean something considerably more specific and considerable. But he didn't know that yet, and she didn't offer it. They talked through the appetizers with the careful rhythm of 2 people who were both doing this reluctantly and had both, somewhere around the second glass of wine, stopped being entirely reluctant. She was sharper than he expected, not in a performance of intelligence way, but in the way of someone who had thought seriously about a wide range of things and was comfortable not agreeing. She pushed back on something he said about urban planning. He pushed back on something she said about risk assessment. It didn't go anywhere ugly. It just felt like conversation between adults, which was rarer than it should have been. Somewhere between the entrees and the moment the waiter materialized with a dessert menu neither of them had asked for, Victoria set her fork down and looked out the window for a second. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask." "Joel mentioned you've been raising your son alone for a long time." Landon took a breath. "Since he was 4. His mother and I, it wasn't a marriage that should have lasted as long as it did. When it ended, Marcus stayed with me." He paused. "He's 15 now. He's fine. We're fine." "I didn't mean to imply otherwise." "I know." He looked at his plate. "People ask about it like it's a wound. Sometimes it is. Mostly it's just a fact. Like having a mortgage or a bad shoulder." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "That's a very honest way to put it. I've had 11 years to figure out how to talk about it." She nodded. Then, unexpectedly, she said, "I grew up in Boston. Well, went to school there. For a while it felt like I grew up there more than anywhere else." "What school?" "BU," she said. "I did my undergraduate there, then a master's at MIT. The MIT years were more transactional, but BU, I loved Boston in those years. I lived near Kenmore Square my first 2 years, and then moved closer to campus." She paused, and her expression did something subtle, softened in a way that seemed involuntary. "There was this coffee shop, nothing special really, cramped, terrible lighting, the espresso machine broke down about twice a week. But the guy who ran it had this ancient radio behind the counter that was always playing something good." Landon did not move. I used to go there almost every morning for 2 years, she continued. Her voice had shifted slightly, less measured, like she was following a memory rather than constructing a sentence. I met someone there. We used to spend hours there, talking about everything, architecture, cities, what kind of life we were going to build. She paused. It's funny how specific certain places stay. I drove past it once, about 8 years ago, and it was a dry cleaner's by then, but I still thought about it. The restaurant noise continued around them, glasses clinking somewhere behind Landon's right shoulder, a burst of laughter from a table near the window. He thought about a coffee shop on Boylston Street with an espresso machine that was either working brilliantly or making a sound like a dying radiator. He thought about a 20-year-old version of himself sitting across a two-person table from a girl with dark hair who talked about cities like they were living things. He thought about the morning he woke up and found her gone. "Did you ever look for him?" he asked, and his voice came out more careful than he intended. Victoria looked at him for a moment. There was something in her expression, not recognition, or at least not quite, more like a flicker of something that she chose not to name. "No," she said. "I didn't think that was fair." He nodded slowly. He picked up his wine glass and set it down again without drinking from it. "Victoria," he said, "can I suggest something that might sound a little strange?" She watched him. "Go ahead." "What if we agreed, just for tonight, to be strangers?" He met her eyes. "No backstory, no context we bring in from wherever we've been. Just two people who are here, in this restaurant, eating decent salmon." She was quiet for long enough that he thought he'd miscalculated completely. Then she said, "Why?" "Because I think the evening has been going reasonably well," he said, "and I'd like to see where it goes without either of us carrying anything heavy." Another pause. She studied him with those dark, careful eyes. "All right," she said finally. "Strangers." They didn't shake hands on it. They didn't make it a thing. The waiter came with the dessert menu, and Landon ordered the chocolate torte he didn't particularly want because it bought him 10 more minutes at the table, and Victoria ordered coffee and looked out the window briefly and then looked back at him with something new in her expression, something that was almost but not quite relief. He drove home that night with the radio off and Marcus's bedroom light still on when he pulled into the driveway, which meant the kid had been waiting up. He sat in the car for a moment before going inside. Somewhere in Boston, 20 years ago, he had been the kind of person who believed completely in the future. He had unlearned that over a long time, carefully and deliberately, the way you take apart something structural, load-bearing thing by load-bearing thing, until what's left can survive on its own without collapsing. I wasn't sure what tonight was yet. He wasn't sure if it was a second chance or a slow-motion collision. He got out of the car, walked up the porch steps, and pushed open the front door of the house he had been maintaining, carefully and alone, for 11 years. "How'd it go?" Marcus called from upstairs. Landon dropped his keys on the hook by the door, took off his jacket, stood in his own hallway for a second in the particular silence of a house where someone else's life was being held in trust. "Fine," he said. "Go to sleep." He called her 4 days later. Not 3. 3 would have suggested he'd been counting, which he had been, but 3 felt too obvious even to himself. 4 was the number of days it took him to finish a site inspection report, help Marcus through a particularly brutal calculus problem set, replace the kitchen faucet that had been dripping since November, and run out of reasons not to pick up the phone. He didn't text. That felt like hiding behind something. He called, stood in his kitchen at 8:15 on a Thursday evening with the dinner dishes still in the drying rack, and waited through 2 rings. She picked up on the 3rd. "Landon," she said. Not a question. She'd saved his number, which told him something. "I was wondering if you wanted to get dinner again," he said. "Somewhere less formal. There's a Thai place near Fremont that's basically a converted garage, but the food it's worth it." A pause. A converted garage. They have good lighting, relative to most garages. That's a very low bar. The curry clears it easily. She laughed, a real one, short and unguarded, and said yes. That was how it started, not with any declaration or moment of conscious decision, but with a phone call in a Thai restaurant where the tables were mismatched, and the owner's cat wandered between the chairs, and Victoria Sinclair, billionaire, ate green curry with a plastic fork and didn't seem to mind at all. They fell into a rhythm the way people do when neither of them is trying to make it happen, and both of them are too tired to pretend they don't want it to. Dinner on Thursdays. Sometimes a walk after, along the waterfront, or through whatever neighborhood they happen to be in, talking about nothing with the specific intensity of people who are actually talking about everything. She asked him questions, real ones, not the social courtesy kind, about his work, about the bridge project, about what it felt like to build something that other people would use every day without ever thinking about the person who calculated the load tolerances. It's satisfying, he said one evening, leaning on a railing above the water with the city lights doing their thing on the surface below. Not glamorous, but there's something about knowing a structure will hold, that people can walk across it and not think about it at all. That's kind of the goal, actually, to be invisible. That sounds lonely, Victoria said. It sounds professional. She looked at him sideways. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He didn't argue the point. He'd learned quickly that arguing with Victoria for the sake of winning was a waste of energy, because she didn't argue to win. She argued to locate the actual truth of something, which was a different and more uncomfortable exercise. What he hadn't told Joel, and hadn't told Marcus, and hadn't said out loud to anyone, was how much of himself he was already giving to these Thursday evenings. He noticed it the way you notice a structural change in something you've been monitoring for a long time. A small shift in load distribution, a stress pattern that hasn't appeared before. He thought about her during the week in the particular low-level way that means something has rearranged itself without asking permission. He still hadn't told her who he was. This fact sat in the back of his mind like a nail in a wall that hasn't been properly seated, not causing immediate damage, but not stable either. Every time a conversation edged near Boston, near college, near the years before Seattle and Marcus and the long discipline of being a person who did not need anyone, he felt the nail shift slightly. She never pushed. He didn't know if that was discretion or something else. They were 3 weeks in, 4 dinners, 2 walks, one afternoon at Pike Place Market, where she bought a bunch of dahlias from a woman who'd been selling flowers there for 30 years and seemed genuinely delighted to meet someone who wanted the purple ones. When Landon realized the problem was no longer about whether he could keep the secret, it was about whether he wanted to. The answer, which he arrived at during a site visit while staring at a steel beam that wasn't the problem he was supposed to be examining, was no. He did not want to keep it. He wanted to be known. He had forgotten, in 11 years of organized self-sufficiency, how much a person can want that. But before he could decide what to do with that realization, Marcus happened. Not in a catastrophic way. Marcus didn't do catastrophic. He did quiet and persistent, which Landon had sometimes found more difficult to navigate. He came home from school on a Wednesday with the look of someone who had been thinking about something since at least second period and had been waiting for the right moment to bring it up. "You've been in a better mood," Marcus said over dinner, which was pasta again because it was Wednesday, and Wednesday was pasta night and had been for approximately a decade. "Have I?" "Yeah, you hum sometimes, in the kitchen." Landon put his fork down. "I do not hum." "You do, it's quiet. You probably don't notice." Marcus looked at him with the particular brand of 15-year-old earnestness that was more devastating than any argument. "Is it the woman from the blind date?" "Marcus, I'm just asking." "We've had dinner a few times," Landon said. "It's not a thing." Marcus ate a forkful of pasta and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Are you going to introduce me to her?" "No." "How come?" "Because she is the first person who has made me feel like a version of myself I thought I'd dismantled for good. And I don't know what happens when you bring that into the part of your life you've been protecting the most." "Because it's early," he said, "and it's complicated." "You always say complicated when you mean scary." "I don't." "You do, though." Landon looked at his son. This person he had been responsible for since the kid was 4 years old and terrified of the dark, and used to climb into Landon's bed at 2 in the morning without explanation and fall back asleep in 30 seconds. This person who was now 15 and too perceptive for his own good and was watching his father with an expression that was more compassionate than accusatory. "Eat your pasta," Landon said. Marcus ate his pasta, but the conversation had already done what it was going to do. The following Thursday, they went to a Vietnamese place in the International District that Landon had driven past 100 times and never gone into. It was small and bright, and the woman at the front greeted Victoria like she'd been there before, which meant she had. They ordered too much food and ate most of it anyway. and the conversation wandered through topics the way good conversation does. Not linearly, not by plan, but by the logic of what one thing reminds you of next. At some point, Victoria said, "Tell me something about yourself that you've never told anyone on a first date." "We're not on a first date." "I know, but you haven't told me much." "The engineer stuff, yes. The dad stuff, carefully. But not you." She looked at him steadily across the table. "We've been doing this for almost a month, and I feel like I'm still meeting you at a certain distance." He considered deflecting. He was very good at deflecting. He had perfected it over years of conversations with well-meaning people who wanted to know how he was doing and didn't actually want the real answer. Instead, he said, "I was in love once. When I was young, college age. It was serious. I was serious about it. And then she left and I didn't understand why, and I think I've been angry about that for longer than I've admitted to myself." The restaurant noise continued around them. Somewhere a baby was making sounds of complaint about something important. "What happened?" Victoria asked. "She was just gone one morning, no note, no message, no explanation. We weren't in the text each other constantly era yet, but there were ways to reach someone. She just didn't." He exhaled slowly. "I've spent a lot of years assuming she just decided I wasn't worth explaining herself to. That's probably not fair, but it's where I landed." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. She was looking at the table, not at him, and her expression had done something he couldn't fully read. "Do you still think about her?" she asked. "Not the way I used to," he said. And that was true. He thought about Victoria Sinclair across this table considerably more than he thought about the girl who had left. The problem was they were the same person. She looked up. "I'm sorry that happened to you. It was 20 years ago." "That doesn't mean it wasn't real." He looked at her. She was holding her tea glass with both hands the way she sometimes did, and her eyes were doing the thing he'd noticed they did when she was working something out, a kind of inward calculation, visible at the edges. "Victoria," he said, "are you all right?" "Yes," she said. Then, "No, not entirely." She set the glass down. "There's something I should tell you. I've been trying to figure out when was the right time." His pulse did something it had no business doing in a Vietnamese restaurant in Seattle. "Okay?" She opened her mouth, and then her phone went off. Not a ring, a specific alert tone she apparently recognized, because her expression shifted immediately into something professional and tight. She looked at the screen. "I'm sorry," she said. "There's a situation with a server outage. One of our hospital clients. I have to—" She was already reaching for her bag. "I'm sorry. This is genuinely terrible timing, and I know it looks—" "Go," he said. "It's fine." "It's not fine. It's a terrible time to be interrupted. Victoria, go handle your server crisis." She looked at him for a second with an expression that was something between relief and frustration, and then she was gone, moving quickly through the restaurant with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent years learning how to switch modes on demand. Landon sat alone with the remaining food and the check and the particular feeling of a sentence that has been started and not finished. He paid. He drove home. He sat in the car in the driveway for a while. She had been about to tell him something. He was reasonably certain he knew what it was, and he was equally uncertain what he was going to do when she finally said it. She texted at 11:45 that night. "Crisis resolved. I'm sorry about dinner. Can we talk this weekend?" He wrote back. "Saturday works. You pick the place." She picked a waterfront park south of downtown that Landon had never been to, a quiet stretch of grass and path with the sound of water and the specific smell of a Pacific Northwest autumn afternoon that was not quite cold enough to be uncomfortable, but close. She was already there when he arrived, sitting on a bench with her hands in her coat pockets, looking out at the water. Not at her phone, not doing anything, just sitting. That alone told him how serious this was. He sat beside her. They were quiet for a moment, a companionable quiet that had taken them weeks to build, and which felt slightly different today, charged with the weight of whatever she was about to put down between them. "I recognized you," she said, "about 10 minutes after we sat down at dinner, the first dinner." He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the water. "I saw your face when I mentioned the coffee shop," she continued, "and I knew. I almost said your name right there, but I didn't, because I don't know. Because you just asked me if we could be strangers, and there was something in the way you asked that made me think maybe you needed that. She paused. And honestly, because I was terrified. Of what? Of what you would say. About why I left. He turned to look at her now. She was still looking at the water, her jaw set the way it was when she was not going to let herself come apart, which he had seen once before when she'd mentioned something briefly about a difficult year in her company's early days. Tell me, he said. She exhaled. Your father was sick. He blinked. What? You didn't know I knew. You never talked about it with me. Not really. But you'd mentioned once that he'd been having trouble, some tests that had come back uncertain, and I could hear how worried you were even though you were trying to bury it. She paused. And then I ran into a mutual friend, someone who knew your family. And she told me that the diagnosis had come in, that it was serious, that your father was going to need a lot of care, long-term, expensive, and that you were the only one who was going to be there for him because your brother was overseas and your mother was already struggling. The park, the water, the sound of a couple passing behind them with a dog that was interested in everything. You left because of my father, Landon said. It wasn't a question, but he needed to hear himself say it. I left because I was 22 years old, and I was absolutely convinced that if I stayed, you would spend the next years trying to take care of your father and build a future with me at the same time, and something would suffer for it, probably you. She finally turned to look at him, and her eyes were dry, but only because she was working at it. I thought that if I disappeared completely, you would grieve for a little while and then focus on your family and then eventually find your way to someone else. I thought I was making the generous choice. Landon looked at her for a long moment. He died 2 years later, he said. My father. I was there. I did take care of him. And for years afterward, Victoria, for years, I thought the reason you left was because I wasn't enough, that you saw something in me that wasn't worth staying for. The sound she made was small and broken, and she pressed her lips together. I'm sorry, she said. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. I've known it for a long time, the kind of known where you try not to look directly at it, because if you do, you have to sit with what you chose. He stood up. Not in anger, or not only that. He stood up because he needed to not be sitting, needed to feel the ground under him while he processed the information that the thing that had shaped him most was built on a misunderstanding so complete it was almost architectural in its thoroughness. He had constructed an entire version of himself, the guarded version, the self-sufficient version, the man who didn't need anyone because he had learned that needing people meant watching them leave, on a foundation that was never what he thought it was. You should have told me, he said. You should have asked me what I wanted. Yes, she said. I should have. I didn't need you to decide that for me. I know. I was 22. I would have figured it out. I was capable of... He stopped, took a breath. You took the choice away from me. Yes, she said again. I did, and I can't fix that. He stood at the edge of the path with his hands in his pockets, and the Seattle waterfront doing its indifferent, beautiful thing around him, and he was aware of about 11 different feelings at the same time, which was approximately 10 more than he typically allowed himself. He was angry, not the hot, immediate kind, the cold kind, the kind that has been stored at the back of a very organized internal shelf for 20 years and has not aged particularly well. He was also beneath the anger and the shock and the strange vertigo of having a foundational story revised at the age of 32. He was something else, something that didn't have a clean name, something that was adjacent to relief, which made no rational sense, except that the story he'd been telling himself about who he was and why had just been taken apart, and that was terrifying, and also, if he was honest, a little like putting down something heavy that he'd forgotten he was carrying. He didn't say any of that. He walked back to the bench and sat down. He looked at the water. She sat beside him and didn't say anything either, which was the right call. After a while, he said, "Why didn't you say something at the restaurant, the first night?" "Because you asked me to be a stranger," she said. "And I thought maybe that was actually what we needed, to figure out if there was anything here without all of that between us." "And?" She turned and looked at him. Unguarded, finally, the composure cracked just enough to let the real thing through. There is, she said. For me, there is. But I needed you to know the truth before it went any further. You deserve to know. He sat with that. The dog came back without its owners, briefly, investigated them both with the democratic enthusiasm of dogs everywhere, and then departed. I need time, Landon said. Okay. I'm just saying I need to think. You don't owe me anything, Landon. I know that. I just needed you to know. He nodded. He looked at his hands. He thought about the engineer's habit of assessing a structure under duress, not to condemn it, but to understand where the loads were falling, what was holding and what wasn't, what would need reinforcing, and what had been quietly, silently strong all along. He thought about Marcus, at 15, eating pasta and telling him that complicated was what he said when he meant scared. He thought about a coffee shop on Boylston Street with bad lighting and a radio that was always playing something good. Thank you for telling me, he said finally. That took something. Victoria looked away, back at the water. It took me about 20 years longer than it should have, she said. He didn't argue that point either. He drove home with the radio off again, and this time Marcus was downstairs when he came in, sitting on the couch with a textbook open across his lap, and the particular expression of someone who has been waiting but is trying to look like he hasn't. Landon sat down on the other end of the couch. You okay? Marcus asked. Getting there, Landon said. Marcus looked at him for a second, then looked back at his textbook. He didn't ask any more questions. He just stayed there on the other end of the couch, the way he'd been doing since he was small, not requiring anything, just present. And Landon sat in the quiet of his own house with a story he'd been carrying for 2 decades, sitting differently in his chest than it ever had before. Not gone, not resolved, just different. The weight of it redistributed, landing in places he was going to have to learn how to carry. He gave himself a week. That was what he told himself on the drive home from the waterfront park. 1 week to think it through clearly, to let the information settle the way disturbed sediment settles, to stop feeling like the ground beneath him was made of something other than solid material. He was an engineer. He believed in systems. He believed that if you gave a problem enough structured time and honest attention, you could arrive at the correct load-bearing solution. What he had not accounted for was that grief doesn't behave like an engineering problem. The first 2 days were almost manageable. He worked long hours on the Ship Canal Bridge documentation, came home, made dinner, asked Marcus about school with the attentiveness of a man who is using parental duty as a form of personal scaffolding. Marcus, who was perceptive in the way of teenagers who have spent their whole lives in close proximity to one adult, said nothing and ate his food and left his father alone in the particular respectful way that suggested he understood something was being processed and that asking about it would not help. On the 3rd day, Landon drove to the site of the new bridge deck installation and stood on the temporary platform above the canal for 45 minutes, doing nothing useful. His site supervisor, a 40-year veteran named Dale, who had stopped being impressed by anything about 20 years ago, eventually walked over and stood beside him without speaking for a reasonable period of time. You calculating something? Dale asked finally. Not really. Huh. Dale squinted at the water below. You got the look of a man calculating something, or the look of a man who found out something he didn't want to know. Can it be both? In my experience, it usually is. Landon looked at the steel framework below, the geometry of it, the way each component transferred its load to the next, none of it holding alone, all of it holding together. He'd spent 15 years learning how to read structures under stress. He was considerably less competent at reading himself. He drove home that night and sat at the kitchen table after Marcus had gone to bed and tried to locate exactly what he was feeling, which was the kind of task he had historically avoided with considerable success. What he found, when he was honest about it, was this. He was not as angry as he'd expected to be. He had expected to be consumed by it, that cold, stored anger that had been sitting on the shelf since his 20s. And it was there, yes. But it was sharing space with something more uncomfortable, which was the recognition that Victoria's confession had not just revised the story of what she had done, it had revised the story of who he had been living as ever since. The version of Landon Hayes who had been abandoned, who had decided, quietly and efficiently, that love was a structural risk not worth the liability, who had built a life that was excellent and organized and emotionally impermeable. That version had been constructed on a fact that was not a fact, She hadn't left because he wasn't enough. She had left because she was 22 and frightened and had made the same mistake that people who love others too much sometimes make, which is deciding what's best for someone else without giving them the choice. He knew that mistake. He had been making a version of it for years. That was what sat heaviest. Not what she had done, what he had done with it. He called Joel on day 4 because Joel was the kind of friend who could be called on day 4 of an existential crisis and would pick up on the second ring without making a production of it. "You knew who she was," Landon said without preamble. A pause. "What?" "Victoria. You set me up with Victoria Sinclair. Did you know about Boston?" "Landon, I swear on my marriage I had no idea about Boston. I met her through a client dinner. She seemed like someone who was real and interesting and not currently insane, and I thought of you." Another pause. "What happened in Boston?" "We knew each other a long time ago." Silence on the line, then, "You're serious that, unfortunately." "That's either the best story I've ever heard, or something is about to go very wrong." "Both, probably." Landon leaned against the counter. "She told me why she left. Back then. It wasn't what I thought." "What was it?" He told him. The abbreviated version, 3 minutes, just the bones of it. Joel listened without interrupting, which was not his natural state. And when Landon finished, there was a long enough pause that Landon checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "So she left to protect you," Joel said slowly. "That's one way to say it. What's another way?" "She made a unilateral decision about my life without telling me." "Yeah," Joel exhaled. "Those are both true at the same time, aren't they?" "That's the problem. Are you going to keep seeing her?" Landon didn't answer right away. The kitchen was very quiet around him. The faucet he'd replaced the previous week was holding fine. "I don't know," he said, but he already knew. He just hadn't caught up to himself yet. He texted Victoria on day 5. Short, careful, the kind of message that communicates more by its restraint than its content. "I need a little more time. I'm not going anywhere. I just need to think." She wrote back within a minute. "Take whatever you need. I mean that." And then, because she was Victoria, and apparently could not resist being completely reasonable, even when he was struggling to match it, "I'll be here." He read that last line 3 times. He put his phone face down on the counter and stood in his kitchen with his hands flat on the laminate surface. His father had helped him install 8 years ago, the summer after his dad had been gone for 6 years, and Landon had finally felt ready to buy a house that was his own, rather than a place he happened to be storing his life. The laminate was slightly warped at one corner from a water incident he'd patched but never fully fixed. It was a thing he'd been meaning to address for 2 years. He pressed his palm against it and felt the uneven surface, and thought about how many things a person walks past every day in their own home that need attention and simply don't get it because there are only so many hours and only so much of you to go around. On day 6, he picked Marcus up from soccer practice. Marcus played center midfield with the focused, slightly overcomplicated style of a kid who had read too much about the sport before playing it. And on the drive home, Marcus said, without looking up from his phone, "You've stopped humming." "I told you I don't hum." "You don't anymore, that's what I'm saying." Landon kept his eyes on the road. "Is it the woman?" Marcus asked. "Marcus, I'm not trying to get into it. I'm just... Is it her?" His voice had shifted slightly, losing the banter register, becoming the one he used when he actually meant it. "Because you were different when you were seeing her. Not like dramatically different, but you seemed less..." He searched for the word. "Less like you were managing everything." "I manage things because things require managing." "Yeah, I know you think that." Marcus put his phone in his jacket pocket, which meant he was done with the buffer. "I think you manage things because it's easier than letting them happen to you." Landon said nothing. "I'm 15, Marcus said. "I'm not saying I know more than you. I'm saying I've watched you my entire life. And I know what you look like when you're okay and when you're just making sure everything functions." They drove 2 blocks in silence. "She told me something difficult," Landon said finally. "Something from a long time ago. I'm trying to figure out what to do with it." Difficult like she did something wrong? Difficult like she did something she thought was right at the time and wasn't. Marcus absorbed this with the patience of someone who had grown up watching an adult navigate complexity without much backup. "People do that," he said. "They make decisions for people they care about and get it wrong. That's not..." He shrugged. That doesn't automatically make them bad. I know that. But you're treating it like it does. Landon gripped the steering wheel slightly harder. His 15-year-old son was doing it again. That thing where he located the precise, uncomfortable truth and said it with the straightforwardness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be diplomatic about accuracy. He pulled into the driveway, turned off the car, sat there for a moment. "How are you this perceptive?" he said. "You're 15. "You raised me," Marcus said. He got out of the car. "Also, I read a lot." Landon sat in the car for another few minutes after the front door closed. He thought about the structure of things. Not bridges this time, but the other kind. The architecture of how a person builds their interior life. The choices that become walls. The walls that become load-bearing. The load-bearing things that become so fundamental to the structure that you can't see them anymore. Can't see that they were choices. Because they've become the shape of who you are. He had built himself around a wound that turned out to be a misunderstanding. And that was painful in a way he hadn't fully expected. But the more he sat with it, the more he understood that the wound and the misunderstanding were almost beside the point now. The question was what he was going to do with the architecture he'd built. Whether he was going to keep living in it, or whether he was willing to open a wall. He went inside. He did not sleep particularly well. On the 7th day, he called Victoria. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey," she said. Careful. Not performing calm, just actually trying for it. "Can we meet?" he said. "Yes. When?" "Tonight, if that works." "It works." He suggested the waterfront again, because something in him needed the same geography, needed to go back to the place where the real conversation had happened, and see it differently or see it the same, but see it again. She was there when he arrived, same bench, but standing this time, not sitting, and she had her hands in her coat pockets, and she looked like someone who had not been sleeping particularly well either. He stood in front of her. The water was doing its evening thing behind her, city lights just starting to assert themselves against the dimming sky. "I'm not angry," he said. "I was, but that's not what's left." She waited. "What's left is this," he exhaled. "You made a choice for me, and I've spent the last week recognizing that I've been doing the same thing for 11 years. Not to you, to Marcus, to anyone who might have come close." He paused. "Protecting people from involvement in my life by making the decision for them that they wouldn't want it." Victoria was very still. "I understand why you did it," he said. "I don't agree with it, but I understand it. And I can't be fully angry about it because I've been doing a quieter version of the same thing my whole adult life." "Landon, let me finish." He wasn't harsh about it. I think what I want to say is that knowing the truth doesn't just change how I feel about what you did. It changes how I feel about what I've been doing, and that's a lot to hold at the same time." He looked at her, at the tiredness around her eyes, the careful stillness of her posture, the way she was giving him space without retreating. "I want to keep seeing you. That hasn't changed. But I need you to know that I'm not put together as neatly as I probably seem." "I know," she said. "I don't need you to be. I need you to actually know that. Not just say it." "I know," she said again, and this time it was softer, and it landed differently. "I've known that since the first dinner. You asked me to be strangers because you needed room to be human before you were whatever category I already had for you." She paused. "I thought it was the most honest thing anyone had ever asked me on a date." He looked at her. "It was also avoidance." "Yes, but the honest kind." He almost laughed. It surprised him. The almost laugh came up from somewhere he hadn't accessed in a while. She smiled, cautious, real, the guard down just far enough. "So we're okay?" she said. "We're getting there," he said, which was the truth. And the truth he was relearning was usually more durable than the comfortable version. They walked the path along the water as the lights came fully up on the other side of the bay, talking in the slower, more careful way of people who are rebuilding something rather than discovering it for the first time. Knowing where some of the framing already is, knowing what had failed once and why, trying to be more deliberate about where the weight goes. It wasn't easy. It was better than easy. It was actual. He drove home at 9:30 with the radio on low and a feeling in his chest that was not quite happiness, but was something in the same neighborhood. Something lighter than what had been there for the past 7 days, something with more room in it. Marcus was doing homework at the kitchen table when he came in. He looked up. Better? Marcus asked. Working on it, Landon said. That's the right answer, Marcus said, and went back to his homework. Landon got a glass of water, stood at the counter, looked at the warped corner of the laminate, and thought about how he was going to fix it properly this weekend and had been putting it off long enough. He thought about what it would mean to stop putting things off. The following 3 weeks were different, not easier exactly. Nothing about unlearning a decade of emotional architecture is easy, but more honest. He let Victoria in, incrementally, the way you open a pressure valve, carefully, consistently, not all at once. She was patient with this in a way that he recognized, after some reflection, was a particular kind of generosity, the kind that comes from knowing you contributed to the damage and living with that knowledge while working around it. She didn't push about Marcus. He noted this without comment. She seemed to understand, intuitively or from experience, that some rooms have to be opened from the inside. They drove out to the coast one Sunday. Her suggestion, spontaneous, she'd texted at 8 in the morning and asked if he was doing anything before he had a chance to schedule something safe and structured. He'd said no and gotten in the car and driven to her building, and they'd taken her car up the coast to a stretch of beach that was too cold for tourists and exactly right for the kind of conversation that requires open space and the sound of something larger than yourself. They walked for 2 hours. They talked about their 20s, the real versions, not the curated retrospective, but the actual decade, the uncertainty and the mistakes and the specific loneliness of being capable and lost at the same time. She told him about the early years of her company, the period before the first major funding round when she had been sleeping on a friend's couch and working 18-hour days and genuinely unsure whether she was building something real or just burning her own life down in an interesting direction. He told her about the first years after Marcus's mother left, the mechanical quality of those early months, the way he had organized his way through grief, because organization was the only thing he was certain he could do correctly. You're good at it, she said. The organization. It kept us afloat, he said. But I think I kept doing it long after we didn't need it as a survival strategy anymore. She looked at the ocean. The wind was doing something aggressive to her hair, and she'd stopped fighting it about 20 minutes ago. What would you have done differently, she asked, if you'd known the truth earlier about why I left? He thought about it seriously, the way she always appreciated. Not the first answer, but the second one, after you push past the reflexive response. I think I would have let people in more, he said. I built this whole framework, emotional zoning laws. No one gets too close because close means potentially gone, and I couldn't afford the structural damage while I was raising Marcus. He paused. But Marcus didn't need a fortress. He needed a father who was actually living his life, not just managing it. She was quiet for a moment. He seems like a good kid. He's better than I deserve. I doubt that. He told me recently that I say complicated when I mean scared. Victoria turned and looked at him with an expression that was caught halfway between sympathy and amusement. He's right. I know. Landon looked at the water. It's deeply inconvenient having a perceptive teenager. She laughed. The real laugh. Unguarded. The one he'd been collecting without quite realizing he was doing it. They drove back to Seattle in the late afternoon with the sun doing its low, flat Pacific Northwest thing across the water and the silence in the car, the comfortable kind. The kind that doesn't require filling. He walked her to her building. She lived in a penthouse in a glass tower in South Lake Union that he'd now stood outside twice without going up, which was a choice he hadn't examined too closely yet. And they stood on the sidewalk in the cooling air with the city noise around them. Thank you for today, she said. You suggested it. I know, but you said yes, which is still new for you. He couldn't argue that. She looked at him for a moment. I know you're still figuring out the rest of it, she said. The Marcus part. I'm not rushing that. I know you're not. I just want you to know I see it. How careful you are about what you let into his life. She paused. I think that's good. I think the fact that you're careful isn't the problem. What's the problem? The problem is when careful becomes a policy instead of a judgment. She said it gently, which almost made it worse, because it was exactly right, and he knew it. And the fact that she said it gently meant she wasn't trying to score a point. She was just trying to reach him. You'll know when the time is right. I trust your judgment. She said goodnight. She went inside. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the elevator panel through the lobby glass, the light ascending. He drove home. He made dinner. He and Marcus ate and talked about Marcus's upcoming history project and the soccer season and a podcast Marcus had been listening to about urban infrastructure, which, Marcus insisted with complete sincerity, was actually very interesting. You don't have to like the same things I do, Landon said. I know, but it kind of is interesting. The part about how cities decide which structures to prioritize when they have limited budgets. That's essentially my entire job. I know. That's why I listened to it. Marcus picked up his glass. I was trying to understand what you actually do all day. Landon looked at his son across the kitchen table. This person who had been the organizing fact of his entire adult life, who had not asked to be that, and had carried it without complaint because children carry what's given to them with a grace that adults tend to lose, and felt something move in his chest that was close to overwhelm and arrived quietly. You could always just ask me, Landon said. I know, but sometimes the podcast is more objective. Marcus smiled. His mother's smile, still, after all this time, and Landon had made his peace with that years ago. Can I ask you something? Sure. Are you going to let me meet her? The kitchen settled into its evening quiet around them. Eventually, Landon said. Is eventually soon or eventually? I don't know yet. Marcus nodded. He seemed to find this acceptable. Not fully, but enough. Okay, he said. They did the dishes together in the way they'd been doing dishes together for 11 years. Landon washing and Marcus drying and putting away. The particular domestic choreography of two people who have been doing something together long enough that it doesn't require coordination anymore. Just habit. Just a kind of love that doesn't call itself that because it doesn't need to. He should have known, then, that something was about to go wrong. Not because life is constructed around dramatic irony, but because he was a man who had spent 11 years building something careful and controlled, and the universe has a way of stress testing things that are overdue for it. It came 3 days later. It came not as a dramatic confrontation or a crisis or anything with the decency to announce itself clearly. It came as a feeling, sudden, sharp, arriving somewhere during a Tuesday afternoon site meeting while Dale was talking about the secondary support beams, and Landon's phone was face down on the folding table, and he was half listening and half somewhere else, which was new, which was itself the problem. He was half somewhere else because he was thinking about Victoria. Because she had texted him that morning with a photograph of a mug she'd bought at a street market, because it had a bridge on it and it had made her think of him. Because he had smiled at his phone in his car in the parking garage before heading into the meeting. Genuinely smiled, and then he had thought about Marcus asking if eventually was soon or eventually, and then he had thought about what it would mean to let her into the whole life. Not the measured, compartmentalized version, but the actual thing, with the warped kitchen laminate and the soccer practice pickups and the Wednesday night pasta and all the ordinary weight of it. And what followed the thinking was not a rational decision. It was fear. The old kind, the familiar kind, was the load-bearing kind that had been part of his structure for so long that he'd stopped being able to see it as a choice. The meeting ended. He went back to his car. He sat there and worked through it with the precision of a man doing structural assessment on himself. And what he found was not good. He was about to do it again. He was about to make the decision for both of them, before the possibility of loss could make that decision for him. He called her that evening. She picked up, and he could hear her in what he'd come to recognize as her working-from-home voice, slightly distracted, a half-second of shifting gears before she was fully present. "Hey," she said. "Everything okay?" "I've been thinking," he said. A pause. The slight shift in the quality of the silence on her end. She knew. She was too smart not to know where this was going, and the fact that she didn't try to preempt it, that she just waited, was somehow the hardest part. "I think I need to slow this down," he said. "Maybe significantly." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "I'm not—" He stopped. Started again. "Marcus is at a point in his life where I can't introduce inconsistency into that. I can't let something that might not—" He stopped again. "Landon," she said. Quiet. Not cold. "You don't have to explain. I want to explain. Okay? I just—" He pressed his palm flat on the steering wheel. I don't trust this yet. I don't trust myself in it. And I don't want to bring it into his life and then pull it back. And I think that's the more likely outcome if I'm, he exhaled, if I'm being honest. Is that what you actually think? She asked. Or is that what you're telling yourself so the decision feels responsible instead of afraid? The accuracy of it landed in his chest like something physical. He didn't answer. I'm not going to argue with you, she said, and her voice was steady in a way that cost her something. He could hear it costing her. I told you before I left Boston that I was making the choice for you. I swore I wouldn't do that again, so I'm not. She took a breath. If you need to step back, that's your choice to make. But I want you to make it knowing what you're actually choosing. Victoria, I'll be here, she said, if that changes. But I'm not going to wait without knowing why I'm waiting. So if this is you ending it, say so. And if it's you asking for time, I need to know there's a real reason and not just the same walls with a different coat of paint. He sat in his car in the dark of his own driveway with the front porch light on the way. It always was, and the sounds of his house. Marcus's music, faint through the front window. And he tried to find something honest to say. What came out was, I don't know what it is yet. She was quiet for a long moment. Then figure it out, she said, and she said it without cruelty, without ultimatum, just tiredly, the way someone says something they've been sitting with for a while and have finally decided to put down. The call ended. He went inside. Marcus's door was closed and music was playing from underneath it, and the kitchen light was on and the house was the exact same as it always was. Every surface familiar, every sound accounted for. He stood in the hallway of the life he had built and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that it was not enough. He did not sleep that night. Not the dramatic movie version of sleeplessness. No staring at the ceiling with cinematic torment, no prowling the house in the dark. Just the ordinary grinding kind, where you lie in a bed that is perfectly comfortable and your body refuses to commit to unconsciousness, because your mind has decided that 2 in the morning is an excellent time to conduct a full structural audit of every decision you've made in the last decade. He lay there and thought about the call, about her voice in the last 10 seconds of it. Not cold, not wounded in any performed way, just tired in the specific register of a person who has been patient for a long time and has finally run out of places to put the patience. Then figure it out. He turned the words over in the dark. Not an ultimatum. An instruction. She'd said it the way a person says something true rather than something strategic, and that was the part that stayed with him. He got up at 5:30 because lying there had stopped being useful. Made coffee. Stood at the kitchen window with the mug in both hands and watched the neighborhood do its early morning thing. A dog walker, a car pulling out of a driveway 3 houses down. The particular quality of October light at that hour, which is more suggested than actual. He thought about what she'd said on the waterfront park that first time. I was 22 years old and absolutely convinced. He thought about how conviction and certainty are not the same thing, and how the difference only becomes visible in retrospect, and how much of your life you can shape around the wrong version of events before you even realize the shaping is happening. He thought about his father, not in the grief-adjacent way. That particular rawness had settled into something duller and more integrated over the years, the way injuries do when they've healed imperfectly, but completely enough to live with. He thought about his father in a specific way. The 2 years he'd spent caring for him, working his early engineering jobs during the day, and coming home to the house he'd grown up in at night, learning what it meant to be responsible for someone else's survival. He had been 22, 23, 24. He had not had time to fall apart, and so he hadn't. What Victoria had seen, from the outside, was a young man drowning in obligation. What she had not seen, because he hadn't shown it, because he was already learning how to not show things, was that he had also been managing, not gracefully, messily, exhaustedly, with the specific competence of someone who has no other option, but managing. She had made a decision for a person she didn't fully know yet. He understood that now in a way he hadn't, entirely, on the waterfront. You cannot fully know someone at 22. You are still learning the shape of yourself. But understanding it and being at peace with it were 2 different things, and Landon Hayes had spent a lifetime confusing the 2. The coffee cooled in his hands. He drank it anyway. Marcus came downstairs at 7, registered his father's presence in the kitchen at an unusual hour with a single look, and poured himself a bowl of cereal without comment. They sat at the kitchen table together in the early light, not talking, which was a form of comfort Landon had learned to be grateful for. Marcus had a gift for silence that was almost architectural. He could fill a room with his presence without filling it with noise. And on mornings like this, that was exactly what was needed. It was Marcus who spoke first. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't, really." "Is it about her?" Landon wrapped both hands around the mug. "I ended it last night, or close to it." Marcus set his spoon down. Not dramatically, just put it down on the edge of the bowl and looked at his father with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way of someone working hard at neutral. "How come?" he said. "Because—" he stopped. Because the explanation he'd given Victoria the night before, the one about inconsistency and appropriate timing and Marcus's developmental needs, it had sounded in the abstract darkness of 5 a.m. like exactly what Victoria had said it was. Walls with a different coat of paint. "I was scared," he said. "I dressed it up as something responsible, but it was scared." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Of what?" he asked. "Specifically." "That it would matter, and then not work, and you'd have seen it not work." His son looked at him for a long time with those eyes that were, in this light, more serious than 15 had any right to be. "Dad," he said, "I've watched you be alone for 11 years. That's what I've seen. That's the thing I already know." The kitchen was very still around that sentence. "I didn't think of it that way," Landon said. "I know you didn't." Marcus picked his spoon back up. "You thought you were protecting me from something, but the thing I actually needed was for you to show me that it's possible to try, even if it doesn't work." He ate a spoonful of cereal with the uncomplicated appetite of someone who had just said something important and was continuing his morning. "You taught me to fix things when they break. You didn't teach me to avoid things in case they might." Landon sat with that for a long moment. "When did you get this way?" he said. "Gradual," Marcus said. "You didn't notice because you were busy being the responsible one. It wasn't cruel." Marcus didn't have cruelty in him. He'd gotten his father's directness without his father's guardedness, which was either genetics or a corrective measure the universe had inserted into the arrangement. It landed the way the true things always landed, without drama, without decoration, in the exact spot that had been waiting for it. Landon drove to work. He sat in the parking structure for 11 minutes before going in. He did a site check, reviewed 2 documents, had a conversation with the city liaison about the bridge timeline that required his complete professional attention and received approximately 60% of it. At lunch, he sat in his car again and called Joel. "I pulled back," he told him, "from Victoria." Joel was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Fear." "Yeah." Joel sighed. "That's what I figured when you didn't text me back yesterday." A pause. "What are you going to do about it?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do." He did. He'd known since 5:30 in the morning, standing at the kitchen window with a cooling mug of coffee. He'd known since Marcus put his spoon down on the edge of the bowl and told him 11 years of quiet, accumulated truth without raising his voice once. He'd known since Victoria said figure it out and meant it without malice. The knowing and the doing were the last 2 feet of a very long walk. He worked through the afternoon with the distracted half-competence of a man whose attention is physically in the room but resident somewhere else entirely. Dale noticed everything. It was unclear why anyone had ever tried to hide anything from Dale, and stopped by his desk at 4 o'clock to drop a folder and say, without particular emphasis, "Whatever it is, Hayes, either fix it or put it down, but stop letting it park on your work." "It's personal," Landon said. "I know it's personal. Your calculations were off by 8 millimeters this morning on the south deck spacing. You haven't been off by 8 millimeters since your 2nd year." Dale picked up the folder again. "Fix it or put it down." He left before Landon could respond, which was probably deliberate. Landon stared at the drawings in front of him for a while. 8 millimeters. In bridge engineering, 8 millimeters was something you caught and corrected before it became anything. In the architecture of a life, 8 millimeters of accumulated error over 10 years became a structural problem that eventually required significant remediation. He left at 4:30. He drove, not toward home, but through the city with no particular route, the kind of driving you do when you need the movement without the destination, when the road is less a means to an end and more a place to think that isn't any of the other places your life happens. He drove through Capitol Hill, through the loose commercial stretch of Eastlake, across the bridge over the canal that was not his bridge, but a good bridge, a bridge that had been doing its job reliably for decades without anyone much thinking about it, which was the whole point. He thought about structures that hold, about what they cost, about the difference between something built to resist stress and something built to endure it. Resistance being ultimately more fragile because it doesn't account for the stress that exceeds what you've designed for, while endurance is built on the premise that the stress will come, will exceed your predictions, will test everything, and the structure will hold not because it never gets pushed, but because it was made for the pushing. He parked outside her building at 6:15. It was a glass tower in South Lake Union, 32 floors, the kind of building that announces its own quality with restraint rather than ostentation. Nothing showy, just excellent materials handled by people who knew what they were doing. He'd stood outside it twice. Both times he'd driven away. He sat in the car for 4 minutes. He counted them. Then he got out. The lobby was the lobby of a building that costs what this building costs. A woman at the front desk, a security panel, the understated hum of controlled climate. He walked to the desk and said Victoria Sinclair's name, and the woman called up and there was a pause. And then she looked at him with a new neutrality and told him to go ahead. The elevator was fast and quiet. 32nd floor. The doors opened to a short hallway with 2 units, and Victoria was standing in the open doorway of hers, not having rushed to it, not posed there. She'd just opened the door and was standing in it, in jeans and a plain gray sweater, no blazer, no armor, her hair down in a way he'd only seen a few times. She looked like herself rather than a version of herself constructed for the outside world, and that alone was enough to make the last 4 feet of the long walk considerably harder. He walked down the hallway. He stopped in front of her. "I owe you an honest conversation," he said. She stepped back from the doorway. He went inside. The apartment was large but not showy. Good furniture, clean lines, books everywhere in the slightly disorganized way of someone who actually reads them rather than displays them. A wall of windows faced the water and the city lights were starting to come up, and the whole thing should have felt intimidating in its scale, and it didn't, because Victoria was standing in the middle of it in a gray sweater looking at him like she was waiting to hear something real rather than something managed. He didn't sit down. He wasn't ready to be comfortable yet. "I want to tell you something that I should have said a long time ago," he started. "Not just about last night, about all of it." She was quiet, watching him. "I've been treating my life like a load calculation," he said. "Everything gets assessed for risk before I let it near the structure. And that made sense for a while. So I had Marcus. I had real things to protect, real reasons to be careful. But somewhere along the way, careful became permanent. I stopped being careful as a strategy and started being closed as a personality." He looked at her. "And I mistook that for stability. I thought being emotionally controlled meant I was doing a good job. For Marcus, for work, for everything. I thought the absence of vulnerability was a virtue." Victoria folded her arms. Not defensively, but the way people do when they're trying to hold themselves together without showing that they're trying. "When you told me about Boston," he continued, "the thing that broke wasn't just the story I'd believed about you leaving. It was the story I'd built on top of it, about what kind of person I had to be." He exhaled. "And instead of letting that break open into something better, I got scared. Because if the foundation was wrong, then everything I'd constructed on it is in question. And I didn't want to." He stopped, breathed, tried again. "I ended things because I was afraid to find out what I actually am without the walls up." She was still very still. "And what Marcus said to me this morning," he went on, "was that I've spent 11 years making sure he didn't see something fall apart, and what I actually showed him was someone who never tried." He looked down at his hands. "I taught him to be capable. I didn't teach him that capable people still get things wrong and keep going anyway. That's a gap I can't fix by being more careful. I can only fix it by being more honest." The lights of the city came up fully behind her. Traffic noise came through the glass in the muffled, distant way of the 32nd floor. He looked up. "I'm sorry," he said. "For last night. For making a unilateral decision. For being, as you very accurately put it, afraid and calling it responsible." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. A long enough moment that he registered the possibility she was going to be reasonable about accepting this, and still say that it was too late, that she'd been down this road already, and the distance between the two of them had been built by people with better intentions than his, and still hadn't been worth the damage. Instead, she said, "Do you want to sit down?" He sat. The couch was a deep charcoal gray and marginally too comfortable for a conversation this serious, but he was in it now. She sat across from him in the armchair, not beside him. The slight distance felt right, a little room to be honest in. "I've been carrying something too," she said. "Since the waterfront." "Tell me." She looked at the window for a second, then back. "I've been rehearsing," she said. "Every conversation we've had since I told you the truth. I've been thinking about what I should say, what order to say it in, how to give you enough space without losing ground." She exhaled. "That's not honesty. That's strategy." And I told myself it was consideration, but really it was the same thing I've always done, trying to manage outcomes instead of just being present for them. "That's not—" "It is, though." She said it firmly, not unkindly. "I've been successful for a long time. Success teaches you that if you handle things correctly, you can influence outcomes. And that's true in business. It's not true in this." She gestured between them with one hand. "I can't manage this correctly into working. It either works because we're both actually in it, or it doesn't." He looked at her. "Are you both actually in it?" She looked back at him steadily. "I'm in it," she said. "I've been in it since the first dinner, probably before that, if I'm being completely honest. Because you were in my head for 20 years, and I've been comparing everyone to you since Boston, whether I admitted it or not." She said it without flourish, just put it on the table between them the way you put down something you've been holding for too long. "I'm not telling you that to pressure you. I'm telling you because you asked me to be honest, and I'm trying." He sat with that. The weight of 20 years of her carrying it, and 20 years of him carrying the wrong version of why she'd left. And the strange, exhausting math of two people who have arrived at the same place by completely different roads. "I'm in it," he said. "I've been in it since you tilted your head exactly the way you used to when you were thinking somewhere around the salmon course at the first dinner, and I had to look at the menu to stop myself from saying your name." She blinked. The head tilt. "You still do it. It's the same." She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. The careful composure releasing slightly, not shattering, just easing, like a hand that's been gripping something finally opening. "Okay," she said, quietly. "Okay." "Okay," he said. They sat in the quiet of the 32nd floor with the city doing its glittering, indifferent thing beyond the glass, and neither of them said anything for a little while. Because sometimes the most honest thing you can do is stop talking and let the space between you be what it actually is. Not empty, not managed, but real. Eventually he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "What do you actually want? Not the long-term architecture of it. Not the version you've worked out in case I ask. What do you want right now?" She thought about it. He respected that she actually thought about it instead of firing off the answer that sounded right. "I want to stop feeling like I'm on probation," she said. "Like every conversation is a test I might fail. I understand that I did something that cost both of us a lot. I'm not asking you to forget that. I'm asking—" She pressed her lips together for a second. "I'm asking for the chance to be a real person in your actual life, not a situation you're managing carefully." He nodded slowly. "And you?" she asked. "I want to stop optimizing," he said. "I want to let something be uncertain and stay in it anyway. I've been avoiding uncertainty for so long. I've forgotten that the best things in my life, Marcus, the work I actually love, the friendships that have lasted, none of them were certain. I just got lucky enough to stay in them before the fear had a name." She looked at him for a moment. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me." "I'm working on a new policy," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "The anti-optimization policy." Something like that. She stood up after a moment, not to leave, just to move, the way people do when a conversation has been sitting still for too long and the body needs to catch up with the interior. She went to the kitchen and came back with 2 glasses of water, the completely ordinary domesticity of it somehow more disarming than anything else about the evening. She handed him one and sat back down. "There's something else," he said. "Okay. I want to introduce you to Marcus." He said it before the second-guessing mechanism could engage. Not as a test or a milestone or anything organized, just, he should meet you. He's been asking. She was quiet for a second. Are you sure? No, he said honestly, but I'm doing it anyway. That's the new policy. She smiled then. Not the careful one, not the professional one, but the one he'd seen twice before, both times when she wasn't expecting to. And it was exactly the smile he remembered from 20 years ago on a cold Boston morning when the espresso machine was working and the radio was playing something good, and neither of them knew yet how much they had to lose. Okay, she said. They talked for another hour after that. Easier now, the conversation finding its level the way water does when you stop trying to direct it. She told him about a project her company was developing, a new system architecture she was genuinely excited about, in the way that people only get when the work still means something to them beyond the financial outcome. He told her about the ship canal bridge, the real version, not the professional summary, including the 8mm error Dale had caught and what it had told him about where his head had been. He processed it, which was a thing he'd stopped taking for granted in adult conversations. At 9 o'clock, he said he should get home. Marcus had school in the morning and the house didn't run itself, which was a habit of thought he could hear now as a habit. The reflex to leave before he was fully ready, because leaving on schedule was a form of control he'd always been able to exercise. He left anyway. But not because of the schedule, because it was the right time and he knew the difference now, or was beginning to. She walked him to the door. They stood in the short hallway of the 32nd floor with the soft close of the apartment behind her. Thank you for coming up, she said. Thank you for letting me. He looked at her for a moment. The gray sweater, the hair down, the specific tiredness and openness of a person who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally put it down somewhere safe. He leaned forward and kissed her. Not the first time, but the first time it was just what it was, without the weight of what he didn't know or the strategy of what he was protecting. Just the straightforward fact of it. She kissed him back. And the 32nd floor did what it did, and the city lights continued their work beyond the glass, and after a moment they separated and she was looking at him with something in her expression that was not surprise but was close to it. The expression of something you've been waiting for arriving in the form of itself, rather than the prepared version. Good night, Landon, she said. Good night, Victoria. He took the elevator down, walked through the lobby, got in his car, sat there for a moment in the parking structure with the engine off, not because he needed to think anymore, the thinking had been done, but because he wanted to be still for a second inside a moment that hadn't been managed or calculated or stress-tested in advance. It was just a moment, a real one. Those were rarer than they should have been. He drove home through the city, radio on low, and when he got back, Marcus's light was still on upstairs. He locked the front door, turned off the kitchen light, and stood at the bottom of the stairs. Still up? He called. Reading, Marcus called back. How'd it go? Landon considered the question. All the versions of the answer he could give. Good, he said. Actually good. A pause from upstairs. Then, yeah? Yeah. Another pause. Okay, Marcus said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite relief, but was in its neighborhood. A particular kind of satisfaction that teenagers have when they've been right about something they cared about, and the adult in question has finally caught up. Landon went to bed. He lay in the dark and the ceiling was just a ceiling and his mind was not conducting audits. He slept. He fixed the kitchen laminate that Saturday. It was not a complicated job. A section of warped flooring near the corner where the counter met the wall, the result of a slow leak he'd patched 2 years ago and then never fully addressed beneath the surface. He'd walked past it every morning for 24 months. Every morning it had registered somewhere in the peripheral inventory of things requiring attention, and every morning something else had taken priority. He did it properly this time. Pulled up the damaged section, replaced the underlayment, laid the new board with the patience the job actually required rather than the 30-minute version he'd been planning for 2 years. Marcus came downstairs halfway through, assessed the situation with his cereal bowl in hand, and sat on the counter watching his father work in the particular silence of someone who is genuinely interested but knows that asking questions will slow the process. Why now? Marcus said eventually. Landon set the tapping block against the new board and reached for the mallet. Because I've been walking past it long enough. Marcus ate his cereal. That's kind of a metaphor. I know. Are you aware you've become the kind of person who fixes metaphorical laminate? Eat your cereal, Marcus. Marcus ate his cereal, but he was smiling at it in a way that Landon chose not to comment on. The dinner happened 12 days later. He hadn't built a production around it. That had been a deliberate choice, the anti-optimization policy in practical application. He didn't prepare Marcus with a formal briefing or stage manage the environment into something that announced its own significance. He just told Marcus on a Wednesday evening, the same Wednesday pasta night that had been their weekly constant for 11 years, that Victoria was coming for dinner on Sunday. Not out to a restaurant, not neutral ground. Here. The house that had been the two of them for as long as Marcus could remember. Marcus had nodded, put a forkful of pasta in his mouth, then said, "What should I wear?" "Whatever you want." "Should I try to seem impressive or just be normal?" Landon looked at his son. "Be normal. She's going to figure out impressive on her own." "Okay?" Marcus thought about it. "What's she like?" "She's direct. She's smart in a way that doesn't announce itself. She asks real questions." He paused. "She doesn't pretend." Marcus nodded slowly, processing this. "Does she know about me?" "She knows you exist. She knows you told me I use complicated when I mean scared." Marcus went slightly pink, which was unusual. "You told her that?" "It came up." "That's—" He made a face. "That's kind of embarrassing." "She thought it was accurate." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then quietly. "Is she important to you?" The kitchen held the question for a second. The hum of the refrigerator. The faint drip of the now properly repaired faucet that wasn't actually dripping anymore because he'd fixed that too. "Yes," Landon said. "She is." Marcus nodded once. He seemed to find this answer sufficient. He didn't ask anything else that night. He told Victoria on Thursday. She picked up on the second ring the way she always did. He'd started to understand that she picked up quickly. Not out of eagerness, but because she was decisive. Because hesitation wasn't her nature in most things. Because she'd learned a long time ago that the pause before the answer is where most of the trouble lives. "Sunday dinner," he said. "At the house. You, me, Marcus." A pause that was not hesitation, but something closer to careful breathing. "Okay," she said. "It'll probably be pasta." "I like pasta." Marcus will ask you something that seems casual and is actually a test. He doesn't do it on purpose. It's just how he thinks. "What kind of test?" "Hard to say. He'll find the thing he actually wants to know and ask it sideways." Landon leaned against the counter. "You'll know it when it happens." She was quiet for a second. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "Yes." "Me too." "Okay," he said. "Good. I didn't want to be the only one." She laughed. Quiet, real, the kind that costs something to give. He'd gotten better at recognizing the different registers of her laughter. This one was the one she used when she was moved but didn't want to make a thing of it. Sunday came with the typical disregard that Sundays have for how much weight you've assigned them. The morning was gray and ordinary. Marcus slept until 9. Landon went to the farmer's market, which he did most Sundays, and stood in front of the pasta stall debating between two types of fresh linguine, with the seriousness of a man who understood that the dinner itself wasn't actually about the pasta, and had decided to give the pasta his full attention anyway, because that was the only part he could fully control. He bought good pasta. He bought garlic and good tomatoes and a bunch of basil that smelled the way basil is supposed to smell. He bought a small bunch of flowers without premeditation, just reached out and took them because they were there, and they were the purple dahlias, and he'd been present the day Victoria chose them at Pike Place and understood that they meant something, even if he couldn't have articulated what. He got home and put the dahlias in a glass on the kitchen table, and Marcus came downstairs, saw them, and said nothing, which was its own form of commentary. She arrived at 6. He heard the car in the driveway. He'd been listening for it, though he'd been telling himself he wasn't, and went to the door. She was coming up the porch steps in a coat he hadn't seen before, dark green, and she was carrying a bottle of wine, and her expression was the careful, open one that he'd come to understand meant she was actually feeling a lot, and was letting herself feel it rather than managing it into something smaller. "Hi," she said. "Hi." He stepped back from the door. "Come in." She crossed the threshold of the house that had been his for 8 years, and Marcus's for longer than that, and she stood in the entryway for a moment taking it in. Not the way someone assesses a space for its value or its presentation, but the way someone takes in a place that belongs to someone they care about, looking for the texture of a life they haven't been let into yet. The walls were the original paint, a pale blue-gray he'd chosen years ago without much deliberation and had stopped seeing almost immediately. The photos on the staircase wall, Marcus at 4, at 7, at 10, at 12. A frame with a drawing Marcus had done in 3rd grade of their house that was wildly inaccurate in its proportions, and had been on that wall ever since because Landon had put it up in a moment of sentiment and lacked the mechanism to take it down. The coat hooks by the door with their accumulated geography of jackets and one soccer cleat that had no business being there. She looked at all of it, briefly, not intrusively. "It looks like people live here," she said. "That's the goal." She smiled. Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs. He'd changed, not into anything formal, but a cleaner version of normal, which Landon recognized as effort and appreciated without saying so. He came down the stairs with his hands in his pockets, the physical posture of someone trying to look casual about something he was not casual about. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looked at her. "You're Victoria," he said. "I am." She extended her hand. He shook it, a real handshake, which made her expression shift almost imperceptibly toward approval. "You're Marcus." "Yeah." He assessed her for a half-second in the way he had, the quick internal calibration that Landon had watched him perform in every new social situation since he was old enough to have social situations. "My dad says you ask real questions." She glanced at Landon briefly. "He said that about me?" "He said you're direct and smart and you don't pretend." Marcus shrugged. Those were his words. "They're good words," she said. "I'll try to live up to them." "He also said I might ask you something that seems casual, but is actually a test." Marcus put his hands back in his pockets. "He was right, by the way. I probably will." Victoria looked at Landon with an expression that was trying not to become a full smile. "You told him that." "Preparation is a professional habit," Landon said, and went back to the kitchen. Dinner was not elegant. The linguine was slightly overcooked because he'd been listening for something Marcus and Victoria were saying from the other room and had miscounted the minutes, which was the kind of mistake he hadn't made in years, and which felt, strangely, like progress. The garlic had gone a shade darker than intended. The basil he'd scattered over the top at the end was the best part. That much he got right. They sat at the table that had been 2 people for 11 years and was now 3. And for the first moment after they sat down, it was quiet in the slightly self-conscious way of new configurations, everyone aware of the geometry and not quite ready to pretend they weren't. Then Marcus said to Victoria, without preamble, "Do you actually like doing what you do, or did you just get good at it and then keep going?" Landon stopped reaching for the pasta tongs. Victoria looked at Marcus for a second. Then she said, with complete seriousness, "That's a question I ask myself about once a year. Usually in February, when I'm tired and the budgets are miserable." "And what's the answer?" "Both," she said. "In the beginning, it was pure love. I had an idea and I wanted to make it real, and nothing else mattered. In the middle, it was mostly momentum. The company was moving and I was moving with it, because stopping seemed harder than continuing. Now," she tilted her head, the thinking gesture, and Landon saw Marcus notice it and file it away. "Now I think it's love again. Different love. The kind that knows the cost of the thing and chooses it anyway." Marcus considered this. "My dad says the best structures are the ones that were built for the stress, not the ones that just haven't been stressed yet." Victoria glanced at Landon. "He says that about bridges?" "And apparently about everything else," Landon said. "He's right," she said, and meant it, which landed on Landon in a way he was not fully prepared for. The simple directness of someone confirming something you believe about yourself without being asked to. They ate the slightly overcooked pasta. Marcus asked Victoria about her company in the way he asked about things that interested him. Not to be polite, but because he'd decided it was actually interesting. She answered without the performance she used in interviews or investor meetings, just the real version of how she thought about the work, the problems that kept her up at night, the decisions she'd gotten wrong and spent time learning from. She talked about her project that had failed in the company's third year, a system they'd over-engineered because she'd been afraid of under-delivering, and the way she'd had to rebuild the team's confidence afterward, which had been harder than rebuilding the system. "What went wrong?" Marcus asked. "I made decisions based on what I was afraid of instead of what the problem actually needed," she said. "I overcalculated the risk and underestimated the people." Marcus looked at his father briefly and then back at his pasta. It was a very small look, but Landon caught it, and Marcus knew he'd caught it, and neither of them said anything because the look had already said it. After dinner, Marcus helped clear the table. This was non-negotiable, had been since he was old enough to carry a plate without risk, and then said he had homework, which was probably true, and was also the correct reading of a situation that had been going well and did not need to be pressed further. He paused on his way to the stairs. "It was good to meet you," he said to Victoria. Not perform politeness, just the plain statement. "It was good to meet you," she said back in the same register. He went upstairs. The music started a few minutes later, low enough to indicate thoughtfulness rather than retreat. Victoria and Landon did the dishes together. He washed, she dried, she picked up the dish towel without being asked, and found the cabinet for the plates on the second try, and the wrongness of her being in his kitchen resolved itself into rightness somewhere between the pasta bowls and the glasses. They talked about nothing in particular. The Ship Canal Project, a book she'd been reading that she wanted to know his opinion on. The dahlias, which she'd noticed when she came in but hadn't mentioned until now. "Purple ones," she said, looking at them on the table. "You chose them at Pike Place." She looked at him. "You paid attention to that." "I pay attention to a lot of things," he said. "I'm just working on saying more of them out loud." She handed him the last glass. Their hands were briefly adjacent over the dish rack. It was not a moment he manufactured or decorated in his memory later. It was just a moment, domestic and small and exact, the kind that doesn't get remembered as a turning point, and is one anyway. They sat on the porch afterward with mugs of tea she'd made because she knew where the kettle was by then and had started it without asking. The October air was cold in the particular clean way of Pacific Northwest autumn, and the street was quiet except for a car passing every few minutes and the sound of a neighbor's door closing somewhere down the block. "He's remarkable," she said. Not fawningly, just factually. "He is." Landon held the mug with both hands. "He's better than the circumstances of his growing up probably warranted." "You're the circumstance," she said. "You're why he's like that. And my mistakes are why he's been watching me be alone his whole life and thinking it was normal. He doesn't seem damaged by it." "No," Landon agreed. He thought about how to say it. "He seems like a person who decided that the gaps in his upbringing were his to fill however he chose, not mine to apologize for." "That's very mature for 15. He came out that way. I take maybe 30% of the credit." She smiled at the street. A dog crossed at the far end, owner trailing. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You don't have to ask if you can ask. Just ask." "Okay." She turned to look at him. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I'd stayed in Boston?" He thought about it. Actually thought about it. Let the question in rather than deflecting it into something more manageable. "Sometimes," he said, "when Marcus was small, when things were hard and I thought about it in a mostly practical way, whether it would have been easier with someone." He paused. "But lately I don't think about the alternative much. I think the version of me who went through what I went through is the version who built what I built, Marcus included." He looked at her. "I'm not saying I'm grateful for what happened. I'm saying I can't separate the grief from the outcome anymore. They're the same structure." She was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about it constantly," she said. "For 20 years. Every milestone, every time something good happened, I'd think about whether it would have happened if I'd made a different choice. And every time something was hard, I'd think the same thing." She exhaled. "I don't know if staying would have been better. I know leaving was wrong. Those two things don't resolve each other." "No," he said, "they don't." "I regret the leaving," she said clearly. "I will always regret the leaving, but I don't regret being here now." He looked at her across the porch in the cold October dark. "Neither do I." They sat with that. The tea cooled and neither of them moved to go back inside. The night deepened around the porch in the way that October nights do. Gradually, then completely, the sky giving up its last residual light and committing fully to dark. There's a thing that people who have been through real difficulty sometimes understand and sometimes don't, and it is this. The happy ending is not the destination. The happy ending, if such a term means anything, is a decision that gets made quietly, repeatedly, on ordinary evenings and difficult mornings, and in the middle of disagreements, and through the long, unremarkable stretches where nothing dramatic is happening and you are simply choosing to stay. It is not a moment. It is a practice. Landon Hayes was 32 years old and had spent 11 years believing that the right way to love someone, his son specifically, and by extension anyone who might come close, was to build a structure so sound and self-sufficient that it required nothing from outside. He had been wrong about this in the specific way that people are wrong when they've taken a real lesson. Be careful, be present, be reliable, and applied it with the wrong tool. He had mistaken fortification for stability. He had mistaken distance for protection. He had looked at his own interior life and read its load-bearing walls as permanent when they were always choices. He did not arrive at this understanding all at once. It arrived the way most real knowledge does, incrementally, in fragments, in the middle of site inspections and late-night kitchen conversations, and a Saturday morning on the floor fixing laminate he'd been walking past for 2 years. It arrived in a 15-year-old's voice saying, "Complicated is what you say when you mean scared." It arrived in a woman's voice across a waterfront park saying, "I was 22 and absolutely convinced," and in the recognition that conviction and certainty are not the same thing, and that the people we love are not variables to be optimized around, but presences to be reckoned with, honestly, in real time. Victoria Sinclair had spent 20 years building an empire on the logic of a sacrifice she'd made at 22 and never fully interrogated. She had been successful in ways that most people spend their entire lives trying to be, and she had been lonely in ways that success does not address and occasionally worsens, because the more capable you appear, the less anyone thinks to ask if you're all right. She had carried the weight of the choice she'd made, the way people carry things they can't put down in public, efficiently, invisibly, on the inside where the real damage lives. And she had walked into a Seattle restaurant for a blind date she didn't want, and the man across the table had asked if they could be strangers. And something in that request had broken through every professional adaptation she'd developed for managing things that mattered. She was not perfect. She was strategic when she should have been present, and overconfident in her own assessment of other people's needs. And she had spent so many years learning how to read a room that she sometimes forgot to just be in one. She was working on it. Real things take time. They were both working on it. The following months had the quality of something being built rather than discovered. Deliberate, sometimes difficult, unglamorous in the day-to-day, the way actual construction is unglamorous. Victoria came to Sunday dinners not every week, but most, and she and Marcus developed the sideways approaching friendship of two people who are both too direct to perform liking each other and too honest to fake it, which meant they were, gradually and genuinely, fond of each other in the specific way of people who share a person they care about and have discovered, with some relief, that they can also be interesting to each other on their own terms. He came to her office once. She'd mentioned an architecture decision she wanted a second opinion on, a genuine request, and he'd come and looked at the diagrams and given her his honest read of the structural logic. And she'd listened with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered, and then disagreed with one part of his assessment and been right, which he told her directly. She seemed more pleased by his disagreement than by the parts he confirmed. "You'd rather I pushed back," he said. "I have people who tell me what I want to hear," she said. "They're useless. I need the ones who tell me what's accurate." "You had those people in Boston," he said. "We spent 3 months arguing about urban planning before we agreed on anything." She looked at him across the desk. "I know," she said. "I missed that. There were hard days. A week in December when a disagreement about something small, a miscommunication about a plan they'd each made separately and hadn't coordinated, became a larger conversation about the way they each defaulted to self-sufficiency when stressed. The pattern of two people who had been alone a long time suddenly having to account for another person's schedule and needs and presence. The conversation got edged and uncomfortable, and they both said things that were less generous than what they meant. Nobody walked out. Nobody went silent for days. They worked through it that same evening on the phone with the inelegance of people who are new to doing this together and haven't yet found the most efficient path through each other's specific defensive habits. It took an hour and a half and ended with both of them slightly wrung out and in agreement about what had actually happened and what to do differently. "That was hard," she said at the end of it. "Yeah, but we did it." "We did." A pause. "Is it always going to be that hard?" He thought about it. "No, different hard. We'll get better at the mechanics of it. The hard parts will just be the real problems instead of the communication around the real problems." "That's a very engineering way to look at a relationship." "I'm an engineer." "I know," she said. "It's actually reassuring." He drove to the Ship Canal project site the following week, a Tuesday morning, early, the kind of crisp and clear winter day that doesn't apologize for being cold. The bridge was nearly complete. 3 years of planning, 18 months of construction, and it was almost a thing that existed in the world rather than a thing that existed in documents and calculations and arguments with city liaisons. He walked out onto the deck in the hard hat and vest that were required regardless of how many times you'd been there, and stood in the middle of the span and looked at the water below and the neighborhood on either side and the specific geometry of a structure that was designed to be used without being noticed. Dale came and stood beside him. This appeared to be a Dale thing, materializing beside Landon at significant moments without being invited and standing there until something was said. "Good bridge," Dale said. "Good bridge," Landon agreed. "You were off by 8 millimeters in October. Fixed it." "I know." "Everything else held." "Yeah." Landon looked at the water. "It did." Dale nodded. He looked at the bridge with the expression of a man who has stood on a lot of completed bridges and has not gotten tired of it. "You seem different," he said finally, "since October." "I fixed some things," Landon said. "Personal things?" "Mostly." Dale nodded again. "Good," he said. "The 8 millimeters were a symptom." He walked away before Landon could respond. In late January, Landon and Victoria drove back out to the coast. Her suggestion again, she'd developed a habit of suggesting things that got him out of the careful orbital structure of his routine, and he developed a habit of saying yes, which was still newer than it should have been, but was becoming more natural. They went to the same stretch of beach, too cold for anyone else. The particular January version of the Pacific Northwest coast, which was essentially a different place than the autumn version, wilder, wetter, the kind of cold that gets inside the jacket. They walked. The wind was aggressive in the way it had been before. It did not wait for consent. And Victoria let it take her hair the way she had before, and they walked with their shoulders nearly touching and talked about the year. What it had been. What they were going into. The specific, unremarkable texture of a life being rebuilt in the present tense rather than reconstructed from the past. He stopped walking at some point. She stopped beside him. They stood at the edge of the winter water, which was gray and assertive and completely indifferent to them. And he looked at her, coat collar up, hair blown into something that was purely weather's doing, eyes bright from the cold, and thought about a thing he'd been carrying in his chest for a few weeks and hadn't put into words yet. "I'm not afraid of this anymore," he said. She looked at him. "Of what specifically?" "Of it mattering this much." He said it simply, without decoration. "I spent a long time being afraid of that. That something would matter enough to break me if it didn't work. That Marcus would see it break. That I'd have to rebuild again from something more damaged than what I started with. And now? Now I think I had it backward," he said. "The fear of loss was making me not fully present for the thing itself. I was insuring against a future disaster by not fully inhabiting the current." He paused. "Marcus would say I'm doing the engineering metaphor thing again." "You are," she said, but she said it warmly. "What I mean is," he turned to face her properly, which required effort against the wind. "I'm here. Fully. That's what I mean." She looked at him for a long moment. The ocean was doing its absolute maximum behind her. She was not dramatic about it. She just said, "Me too." He kissed her on a cold January beach with the Pacific Ocean, being difficult about it and neither of them caring. And when they separated, she was already half laughing at the wind, and so was he, and they walked back to the car with their hands in each other's coat pockets because that was the only warm option, and it was fine. It was better than fine. It was the completely ordinary, extraordinary fact of two people choosing each other in the actual weather of an actual life. On the drive back, Marcus texted asking if they were getting food because he'd eaten the last of the cereal and had opinions about dinner. Landon texted back one-handed while Victoria drove. "We'll pick something up. What do you want?" The reply came in 30 seconds. "Thai. The garage place." He showed the screen to Victoria. She was already smiling. "Tell him yes," she said. He told him yes. They drove back towards Seattle through the gray, beautiful, complicated winter afternoon, and the city came up on the horizon the way it always did, gradually, then all at once. And Landon Hayes looked at it and thought about structures that hold. Not because they've never been stressed, not because they were built without flaw or maintained without error, but because the people inside them chose, when the load exceeded their calculation, to stay and figure out where the weight should actually go. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole thing. Marcus was waiting at the door when they got back, which he would later claim was coincidence, though the timing was implausible enough that neither Landon nor Victoria believed him. He held the door open with the particular studied casualness of someone who had absolutely been watching from the window. "You got Thai?" he said. "We got Thai," Landon said. Marcus looked at Victoria. "You picked the garage place?" "Your dad mentioned it had good curry." "It does," Marcus said, and stepped back to let them in. And then, quietly, directed at the floor, clearly not intending it to land as significantly as it did, he said, "Welcome back." It was aimed at both of them. Landon understood that. The coming back that Marcus was referring to was not from the beach. It was longer than that, and older, and Marcus at 15 understood it in the way that children understand things they've been living beside for years without having words for. Until suddenly, they do. Landon put the Thai food on the counter and got plates down, and they crowded into the kitchen together, the three of them, in the slightly too small space of a house that had been built for two and was now asked to hold more than that. It managed. It held. Outside, the city did what cities do. Continued, indifferent, full of its own stories. Inside, in a house with newly repaired laminate and a properly fixed faucet and a drawing on the staircase wall that was wildly inaccurate in its proportions, and had been there for years and would remain, they ate dinner together. It was noisy in the small way of three people who are not performing ease but actually feeling it. Marcus talked about a project at school that he was unreasonably invested in. Victoria asked a question that made him more invested in explaining it. Landon ate his curry and listened to the two of them find the rhythm they'd been slowly building and thought, not for the last time, about how long he'd stood outside his own life, calling it protection. He was done with that. He had been for a while. It had just taken this long to fully believe it. Some things take as long as they take. The job is not to rush them or to wall them off, but to remain present for the duration, available for what comes, honest about what it costs, willing to stay through the uncertain middle, where there are no guarantees and the only thing you have to stand on is the choice you keep making to be there. He had made the choice. He kept making it. That, in the end, was enough. That was in fact everything. He slept better that night than he had in weeks, which told him something about the cost of carrying decisions you haven't made yet, versus the comparative lightness of decisions that have finally been made. He woke at 6, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window in the early light, and noticed that the warped corner of the laminate was still there, still waiting, still a thing that needed addressing. He got out his tools after breakfast and fixed it properly for the first time. Marcus came downstairs at 7:30 to find his father on his knees at the corner of the counter with a heat gun and a roller, coaxing the warped section flat the way it should have been done 2 years ago. Marcus poured himself cereal, leaned against the opposite counter, and watched with the expression of someone who has learned that adults sometimes process things with their hands when their heads have been too full. "You're fixing the counter," Marcus said. "Finally," Landon said. "What changed?" Landon pressed the roller along the seam. "I stopped finding reasons to leave things the way they were." Marcus ate a spoonful of cereal and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Is she coming to dinner?" "Eventually." "You said eventually before." "This time I mean the closer kind." Marcus put his bowl in the sink. He picked up his backpack from the chair where he always left it. He paused in the kitchen doorway. "I think it's good," he said, "in case that matters." It matters, Landon said. The door closed. The house went quiet. He finished the counter repair, wiped everything down, stood back and looked at it, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing finally done right. Not the grand satisfaction of a completed bridge, just the small, honest kind of something that needed doing and got done. He texted Victoria that morning at 9. Sunday dinner, my house, nothing formal. Marcus makes the garlic bread and I make the pasta, and it will probably be Wednesday night pasta on a Sunday, and that's about as far as my range extends. But if you want to come. She replied in 3 minutes, I'll bring dessert. What is he like? He looked at the message for a second. The ease of it, the immediate, practical ease. No negotiation, no careful positioning, just what does he like. Said more about her than most of the longer conversations had. Anything with chocolate, he wrote back. He claims he's not particular, but he is. Noted, she wrote. And then, after a short pause, thank you, Landon. He put his phone in his pocket and went to work. The week had the particular quality of weeks where the significant thing has already happened, and the days between now and its arrival are just the ordinary life that has to be lived in the meantime. He worked. He picked Marcus up from soccer twice. He had a long site meeting about the bridge deck installation that required his full attention and for the first time in weeks received it. Dale reviewed his calculations, found nothing wrong, and said nothing, which from Dale was the closest thing to a compliment the man offered. He did not tell Marcus much about Victoria beyond what Marcus had already worked out himself. He didn't want to manage the introduction, didn't want to prepare his son for a version of her constructed in advance, a highlight reel of her best qualities assembled to win the audience over. He wanted Marcus to meet her, just her. Whatever happened in that meeting would be real, and real was what they were going for now. Thursday, he called Joel. You went back, Joel said immediately. He'd clearly been waiting. How do you know? Because you sound like a person again. You've had the voice of a man doing load calculations on his own feelings for the past 2 weeks. A pause. How'd it go? She's coming to Sunday dinner. A silence. Then, to your house. Yes. With Marcus. That's typically who's at Sunday dinner. Joel exhaled something that wasn't quite a word. Landon, I set you up on one blind date, and you've apparently had the full romantic arc of a man twice your age in the span of a few weeks. I had a head start, Landon said. Technically. The Boston thing, Joel's voice shifted. Are you really okay with all of that? The whole... She left without telling you. You spent 20 years thinking the wrong thing. I'm working on it, Landon said. It's not resolved. It's going to take longer than a few weeks to fully put down. But she was honest when it mattered. That counts for something. It counts for a lot, Joel said. In my experience, most people never get honest at all. He wasn't wrong. Landon had watched enough people, colleagues, neighbors, the general observable sample of the adult world, choose the comfortable story over the true one, indefinitely, building their lives on the version of events that hurt least to carry. He'd done it himself for a decade. The fact that Victoria had chosen to put the true thing on the table, knowing it might cost her everything she'd been quietly, carefully rebuilding since the first dinner, that was not a small thing. That was the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself because it's too tired from actually being done. How's she doing with it? Joel asked. The waiting, the back and forth. Better than I would have, Landon said honestly. She sounds like someone who's done some work on herself. She has. She just doesn't perform it. He paused. She's the most genuinely unperformed person I've met in a long time, for someone who runs a $4 billion company. Joel was quiet for a second. Wait, 4 billion? Give or take. Landon, you buried that detail. It's not the relevant detail. No, but Joel seemed to be recalibrating something. The woman I set you up with is a person, Landon said, who makes decisions and gets them wrong and owns them, same as everyone else, more or less. He looked at the kitchen counter, smooth now, properly fixed, the warped corner finally flat. That's the relevant detail. Sunday arrived the way Sundays do, without fanfare, gray-skied in the way of Seattle in November, the kind of light that makes interior spaces feel warmer by contrast. Landon made the pasta sauce from scratch in the morning, which was something his father had taught him, and which he had taught Marcus in turn. The way certain things pass through families not as legacies but as habits, unexamined until you're standing at your own stove and recognizing the movement of your own hands as someone else's. Marcus came downstairs at 11, registered the early cooking activity, and without being asked began prepping the garlic bread, butter, garlic, parsley, the pull-apart loaf from the good bakery on Fremont that they only got on occasions, which itself was a communication. They cooked in the same kitchen, silence they'd been practicing for years. The coordinated non-coordination of two people who know each other's rhythms well enough that sharing a small space doesn't require negotiation. Marcus asked twice what time she was coming. Landon said 6. Marcus asked at noon and again at 2:30, which told Landon more about his son's investment in the evening than any direct statement would have. At 5:50, a car pulled up outside. Landon knew because Marcus was suddenly extremely focused on his phone in the living room in the way of someone who wants to appear unbothered and is therefore very obviously bothered. The doorbell rang at exactly 6. Landon opened the door. She was standing on his porch in a dark coat with a bakery box in both hands, and she'd dressed in the way of someone who understood the assignment. Not the blazer and boardroom version of herself. Not the carefully assembled public face. Dark jeans, a soft burgundy top, her hair back but not formal. She looked like herself, the same way she'd looked in the gray sweater on the 32nd floor, and he appreciated it more than he could have said. "Hi," she said. "Hi." He stepped back. "Come in." She came into his house, into the hallway where he'd been standing alone on the night of the first dinner, hung his keys on the hook, taken off his jacket, and thought, "I don't know what tonight is yet." She stood in it now and looked around with the unhurried curiosity of someone who is genuinely interested in the life a space reflects, and not performing the interest. "It smells incredible," she said. "Pasta," he said, "and Marcus's garlic bread, which he takes more seriously than the rest of us take most things." From the living room, "I can hear you." "I know," Landon said. He looked at Victoria. She was already almost smiling. They went into the living room. Marcus was standing up from the couch. He'd stood up before they got there, which meant he'd been sitting there specifically to have a place to stand up from, which Landon found both transparent and deeply endearing. He was 15 years old and 6 feet of barely managed self-consciousness, and he was trying very hard to be natural. "Marcus," Landon said, "this is Victoria." Marcus put out his hand. "Hi," he said. "I'm Marcus." Victoria shook his hand. "I know," she said. "I've heard a lot about you." "From him?" Marcus glanced at his father. "What did he say?" "That you're perceptive," she said, "and that you take the garlic bread seriously." Marcus considered this. "Both true," he said. "I brought up the garlic bread first so we'd have something to talk about if it got awkward." Victoria looked at him for a second. "That's good strategy," she said. "What's the actual approach on the garlic bread?" And just like that, not smoothly, not without effort, but genuinely, they were talking. Marcus explaining the pull-apart technique, the specific ratio of garlic to butter that his father had spent years resisting and eventually accepted, the bakery on Fremont, whose bread he'd argued was worth the price differential. Victoria listening with the same quality of attention Landon had noticed in their first conversation. Real listening, not waiting to respond listening, and asking the kind of follow-up questions that meant she'd heard what he said. Landon went back to the kitchen to finish the pasta. He stood at the stove and listened to his son talk to the woman who had been missing from his life for 20 years, and the specific texture of that moment was something he did not have a category for and was not going to try to categorize. He just let it be what it was. Dinner was not seamless. It was a Sunday dinner at a house where a single father and his teenage son had been the consistent population for 11 years, and the addition of a third person changed the geometry of the table in ways that required minor adjustments. Victoria knocked over her water glass, reaching for the breadbasket, and the recovery of that, the genuine, unguarded embarrassment, the way she said, "I'm so sorry, that was fully my fault," and Marcus said, "Don't worry, he does it too," and looked at his father with an expression of cheerful betrayal, was somehow the thing that shifted the evening from careful to real. They ate. They talked. Marcus asked Victoria about her company with an attention to the technical detail that surprised her visibly. He'd apparently done some reading, something Landon hadn't known about, and filed away his information about his son's level of investment. She answered seriously, without the simplified version she sometimes deployed. And when Marcus pushed back on something she'd said about data centralization, with a point that was more informed than she'd expected, she looked at him with what Landon recognized as genuine respect. "You've thought about this," she said. "A little," Marcus said, with the studied casualness of someone who had thought about it more than a little. "You ever thought about engineering, software, or otherwise?" "Dad's trying to get me into structural," Marcus said. "I'm not opposed. I think I might want to do both. Is that a thing?" "Systems engineering," Victoria said. "Absolutely a thing. The people who understand physical structures and digital infrastructure at the same time are genuinely rare, and the world has enormous need for them." She paused. "I'd argue that's where the most interesting problems are in the next 20 years. Marcus looked at his father. "She thinks like you," he said, in the structural metaphor way. "I've noticed," Landon said. After dinner, Marcus cleared the table without being asked. Another thing Landon filed away without comment. And Victoria brought out the bakery box. A chocolate torte, dark and serious. The kind that suggests someone asked a professional rather than grabbed something from a grocery display. "He said you like chocolate," Victoria said, setting it on the table. "And I may have been slightly excessive about it." Marcus looked at the torte with the focused appreciation of a teenager being offered something genuinely excellent. "This is not excessive," he said. "This is appropriate." Landon cut 3 pieces. They ate dessert at the kitchen table with the pasta dishes still in the sink and the garlic bread reduced to crumbs, and the particular ease of a meal that has reached the stage where no one is performing anymore. The conversation wandered. Marcus's soccer season, the bridge project, a documentary Marcus had been watching about the history of American cities that he insisted on describing in more detail than a summary strictly required. Victoria listened to all of it, and when she had something to add, she added it. And when she didn't fill the space with noise. At 9, Marcus stood up, announced he had homework that was technically due tomorrow and had been technically due tomorrow for the last 3 days, and said goodnight. He shook Victoria's hand again. Not the self-conscious version from the beginning of the evening, but the natural version, the end of a real conversation handshake. "It was nice to meet you," he said. "It was really nice to meet you," she said. Marcus went upstairs. His door closed. The music started, low, the kind he kept low when he knew there were people still talking downstairs, another small consideration Landon noticed and did not say anything about. He and Victoria sat at the kitchen table in the aftermath of the evening, with the dishes in the sink and the November dark outside and the specific quiet that follows a dinner that has gone better than you let yourself hope for. "He's remarkable," she said. He has his moments." "No, I mean," she looked at him. "He's genuinely remarkable. He's curious and direct, and he doesn't perform. Do you know how rare that is at 15? Most adults can't manage it." "He grew up without a lot of people to perform for," Landon said. "It was mostly just us. I think that removed certain incentives." She was quiet for a moment, then, "You did a good thing, raising him the way you did." "We did a good thing," he said. "Him and me both. He raised me a little in return. I don't think that part's optional." She looked at him with an expression that was tired in the good way, the way of an evening that has used up your social reserves and left behind something more valuable. "Are you going to tell me what you're thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking this was the right thing," he said. "Dinner, tonight, all of it." He looked at his hands on the table. "I'm thinking I've been making this harder than it had to be for a long time, and tonight was easy in a way that I didn't expect." "It wasn't entirely easy," she said. "I knocked over a glass." "That was the best part," he said. She laughed, the real one, the unguarded one. He'd been collecting them since the first dinner, and he had enough of them now to know they were the truest indicator of where she was. When Victoria Sinclair laughed the unguarded laugh, she was all the way present, not managing, just there. He did the dishes. She dried them without being asked, which was either instinct or a deliberate choice, and either way it was the right thing to do in someone else's kitchen after a dinner that has gone from careful to real, which was the trajectory of the evening and of the whole of it, really. From careful to real, every part of it. They stood at his kitchen counter afterward. The fixed laminate was beneath her hands, and she didn't know what it had looked like before or why the repair of it had mattered, and it didn't matter that she didn't know. It was just a counter, just a thing that was better for having been attended to. "I should go," she said. "I know, but I don't particularly want to." I know that too. He walked her to the door. She put on her coat, picked up her bag, stood in his hallway, the same hallway where he'd stood alone thinking about what tonight was, and turned to face him. Thank you, she said. For this. For all of it. The going back to the apartment and the honesty and… She stopped, simplified it. For letting me in. Thank you for waiting for me to figure out how, he said. She kissed him once, in the hallway of his house, in the place where he hung his keys and took off his jacket and had been managing carefully and alone for 11 years. And it was not a cinematic moment in any externally observable way. No music, no dramatic lighting, just two imperfect people in a hallway on a Sunday night in November after a dinner where someone knocked over a water glass and a teenager discussed garlic bread technique with the seriousness it deserved. But it was the most fully present Landon Hayes had been in his own hallway since he'd moved in. She left. He closed the door. He stood in the house and listened to the particular quality of the silence. Not the empty kind, not the maintained kind, but the kind that comes after an evening that has actually happened rather than been managed into happening. He turned off the porch light, went upstairs. Marcus's door was slightly ajar, which it sometimes was on nights when he wasn't fully settled. Landon stopped in the hallway. Through the gap he could see his son at his desk, textbook open, actually doing the homework that had been due for 3 days. She's good, Marcus said, without turning around. Yeah, Landon said. Like, actually good. Not good in the way people are good when they're trying to make an impression. I know. Marcus turned around in his chair. He looked at his father in the doorway with the direct, earnest assessment that Landon had never been able to fully deflect. Are you going to be okay? He asked. With all of it, the past stuff and the starting over stuff. Landon leaned against the doorframe. I think so, he said. Not overnight, but yeah. That's the right answer, Marcus said. He turned back to his homework. Night, Dad. Night. The thing about second chances, the thing nobody tells you because it's not the part of the story anyone wants to sit with, is that they don't feel like second chances when you're in them. They feel like the ordinary, difficult work of being in something real. The first chance has the advantage of ignorance, of not yet knowing what love costs or what loss does to the architecture of a person over time. The second chance comes burdened with all of that knowledge. It comes to two people who have been shaped by the absence of each other, who have built whole versions of themselves in the gap, and it asks them to put those versions down without losing everything they genuinely learned in the building. That is the harder thing. Not the reunion, not the moment of recognition, or the confession, or the walking back through the door. The harder thing is the morning after the Sunday dinner, and the morning after that, and the long series of ordinary mornings in which two people who have reasons not to trust choose to trust anyway, not because the fear is gone, but because they have decided, consciously and daily, that the fear is not the loudest thing anymore. In the months that followed, Landon learned this in the specific, unromantic way that real things are learned, through accumulation rather than revelation. There was no single morning when he woke up and found that the guardedness had dissolved. There were many mornings, each one slightly different, each one requiring a small act of deliberate openness that did not feel heroic because it was too ordinary for that. Answering a text before he'd decided what the safest answer was. Telling her about a difficult day at work without editing it into a more manageable version. Letting her see the Tuesday night exhaustion, the Wednesday pasta routine, the Friday night where he fell asleep at 9:30 on the couch, and Marcus put a blanket over him and she knew about it because Marcus texted her a photo, which Landon found out about 3 days later and responded to by feeling something complicated that settled, eventually, into gratitude. She was not easy. He would not have wanted easy. She had opinions and she stated them, and she pushed back when he defaulted to emotional management instead of emotional honesty, which was often enough in those first months to require adjustment. She worked long hours and sometimes vanished into her company for stretches of days when something required the particular intensity she brought to problems, and he learned not to interpret the silence as absence. She learned not to assume that his directness meant coldness, and that the way he showed up, reliably, consistently, without announcement, was itself a language, and one she had not had spoken to her often enough. They were not always good at it. There were conversations that required more than one attempt. There was an argument in February, a real one with edges, but about something that was ostensibly about scheduling but was actually about the older thing, the one they were both still finishing the work of putting down. She said something sharp. He went quiet in the particular way that she had learned to recognize as the walls trying to come back up. They didn't speak for 2 days, which was the longest 2 days either of them would acknowledge when later talking about it. On the third day, she called him. He picked up. "I shouldn't have said that," she said. "No," he said, "but I shouldn't have gone quiet. That's the thing I said I wasn't going to do." "We're both still learning," she said. "Yeah," he said. "We are." "Can we have dinner?" she said. "Not to fix it, just to sit in the same room." "Yes," he said. They had dinner, they sat in the same room, and the argument didn't disappear. It became a part of the record, the specific evidence that they were in something real enough to get wrong and real enough to stay in after getting it wrong, which is the only evidence that counts. Marcus watched all of this with the quiet intelligence he brought to everything, the keen and mostly non-intrusive observation of a teenager who had been waiting his whole life for his father to be fully in his own life rather than maintaining it from a controlled distance. He never made a production of his approval. He showed it in the specific and unspectacular ways available to teenagers, asking Victoria questions with genuine interest, texting her occasionally about the Urban Infrastructure podcast, accepting rides from her without making them weird, bringing her into the ongoing debate about whether the garlic bread method was improvable or whether improvement was the wrong goal. On a Saturday in March, 3 days after the bridge deck installation, on the ship canal crossing, reached a milestone Landon had been working toward for 2 years. Victoria came to the project site. She stood on the temporary viewing platform in her coat, with the wind off the water, doing what it did, and looked at what was there, the span of it, the geometry, the cold, specific beauty of engineered steel doing exactly what it was calculated to do. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "They usually are," he said. "When you've been looking at the drawings for long enough, the real thing can feel like a surprise." She looked at the bridge. He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about what it will look like when people walk across it," she said. "And don't think about who made it. Just use it. Just go wherever they're going." "That's the whole point," he said. She turned and looked at him. "I know," she said. "I understand that about you now. The wanting to be invisible inside the work. The satisfaction of something that holds without announcing itself." He looked at her. "You understand a lot more than I've told you." "You've told me more than you think," she said. "You just don't always use words for it." The wind came off the water. The bridge did what bridges do. Held, without drama, against the load. He took her hand. They stood on the platform above the ship canal on a cold March morning and didn't say anything else for a while, and the city moved around them with its ordinary, enormous, indifferent energy, and none of it required their commentary. What Landon understood, in the accumulated way of things understood by living rather than concluding, was that the life he'd been maintaining all those years was not a failure. It was the right life for the time it was built for. The discipline of it, the careful competence of it, the love that ran through the core of it even when it couldn't speak its own name, none of that had been wrong. It had been what was needed. He had kept his son afloat and himself functional and had built things that would outlast him, and there was nothing small in that. But a life maintained is not the same as a life lived. He had learned the first so thoroughly that he'd forgotten the second was available. That was the real loss of those years. Not the romantic one, not the 20-year gap with Victoria, but the narrowing that happens slowly and quietly when a person decides that the most important thing is to not need anything they might not be able to have. Marcus was right that the longest damage was not the absence of love, but the absence of its example. The 15 years of watching his father be capable without being open, efficient without being present, reliable in the way of infrastructure, and not always in the way of a person who has skin in the game of his own life. The repair of that was not dramatic. It didn't happen in a single night, or a confessional conversation, or even a very good Sunday dinner, though the Sunday dinner helped. It happened in the dailiness of choosing differently, choosing to text back before the managed version was ready, choosing to stay in the room when the room was uncomfortable, choosing to put down the control and pick up the uncertainty and live inside it without a structural assessment every 5 minutes. He was not finished with it. He would not be finished with it. But finished was not the goal. Present was the goal. Present and staying, and choosing it again every morning before the fear could establish itself as the loudest voice in the room. Victoria never asked him to become someone else. This was the thing about her that he had not expected and had needed most. Not the patience, though she had that, and not the honesty, though she had that too. It was the fact that she did not require his transformation as the price of her presence. She had come into the life he had actually built: the pasta on Wednesdays, the Subaru with the dent in the passenger door, the soccer pickups, the kitchen counter that had needed fixing for 2 years, and had not looked past any of it in search of the version she needed him to be. She had looked at it and said, in word and in the more reliable language of showing up, "This is the part I want to be in." That was not something Landon Hayes knew how to say thank you for in any register that would adequately cover it. So he said it in the ways available to him: the reliable showing up, the hand taken on the viewing platform above the canal, the Sunday dinners that became a standing arrangement rather than a deliberate occasion, the morning in April when he drove Marcus to school and came back and found her in his kitchen, making coffee she'd made in his kitchen before, but this time without the slight self-consciousness of a guest, just the easy competence of someone who belongs in a space and knows it. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. "Coffee's almost done." "I can see that," he said. She looked at him for a second. "You're doing the face." "What face?" "The one where you're thinking something you're not sure how to say." She poured 2 mugs, brought one to him. "So say it." He took the mug, stood in his own kitchen doorway in the morning light with the fixed counter and the keys on the hook, and the evidence of a life that had been lived in carefully and was now being lived in differently, and looked at the woman who had been missing from it for 20 years and had come back not as a resolution, but as a real person, complicated and honest and imperfect and here. "I'm glad you came to dinner," he said. "That first one. The blind date." She considered this. "It took you 4 days to call." "I know." "I thought you weren't going to." "I thought about not calling," he said honestly. "And then I ran out of reasons not to." She looked at him over her coffee mug. "What was the reason you did?" He thought about it. The real answer, not the first one. "Because I was already thinking about you during the week," he said. "And I decided that meant something worth finding out about." She held the mug in both hands the way she did. The morning came through the kitchen window the way it did. Upstairs, the house was quiet in the way of a house where a teenager is asleep and doesn't need to be anywhere for 2 more hours. "That's a good reason," she said. "I thought so," he said. He went to the table. She sat across from him. They drank their coffee in the particular morning quiet of 2 people who have earned the quiet, not through ease, but through all the specific difficult work of staying when leaving would have been more comfortable, of choosing the uncertain over the safe, of building something real in the full knowledge that real things break and require repair and are worth the repair, because the alternative is living in something hollow and calling it safe. The Ship Canal Bridge would open to the public in June. Landon would not attend the ceremony. He never attended the ceremonies. That wasn't why he built things. But Marcus would go, because Marcus wanted to see the moment when the structure his father had spent years calculating became a thing that ordinary people walked across on their way to wherever they were going, without a single thought for what it cost to build. And Victoria would go, because by June she would be the kind of person who goes to the things that matter to the people she loves, not as a gesture, but as a fact. The same way she showed up on Tuesday nights and Saturday mornings, and all the intermediate occasions that aren't marked on any calendar, but are the actual substance of a shared life. And the bridge would hold, because that was what Landon Hayes built. Things that held. And this time, finally, he was one of them.